Welcome to MysteryCon, where we explore real conspiracy theories and the mysteries of the unknown to help you unwind and drift into sleep. Before we begin, like this video, subscribe to stay updated, and comment below where you're watching from and how your day went. We love hearing from you. Now let's get into tonight's story. They told us it was just a rumor, a curiosity buried in the margins of church history. But I saw the footage with my own eyes, and once you've seen the crucifixion from a camera made in 1956, nothing ever feels real again. I started working at the Pontifical Institute of Sciences in the autumn of 1983. I wasn't clergy, nor particularly devout. I was an archivist. My role was simple: convert delicate manuscripts and obscure theological correspondence into digital formats. There was comfort in the monotony. Days passed in silence, interrupted only by the gentle hiss of the scanner and the dry shuffle of parchment. The Vatican has its own gravity, pulling everything into stillness. I liked that. I never questioned what I was preserving, only how to preserve it. But everything shifted the day I received an internal transfer marked Level S. It was a classification I'd never encountered. The accompanying note was brief and unsigned. Report to Father Benedetti. Do not discuss this assignment with anyone. There was no signature, no explanation, just a destination. I thought it was an error. Archivists don't get summonses like that. But I went anyway. Benedetti operated in the sub-levels beneath the Apostolic Library. I'd been in that building hundreds of times, but never beyond the public archives. Down there, the air was colder, metallic, humming faintly with electricity. The corridor ended at a lead-lined door that looked more suited to a bunker than a Vatican office. Inside, the room was dimly lit and cluttered with equipment: oscilloscopes, vacuum tubes, spools of magnetic tape. And at the center sat a strange machine that looked decades out of place. It resembled a television, but the casing was armored, and the control panel bore symbols I didn't recognize. Benedetti didn't introduce himself. He simply looked up from a console and asked, "What do you know about time?" I said nothing. He didn't wait. "We believe we've recorded it. You're here to catalogue the findings." I thought it was some kind of theological metaphor, until he powered on the machine. The screen flickered, then steadied. I saw men in robes speaking Latin. A stone courtyard, a Roman standard, the date labelled on the reel, March 28th, 33 AD. These recordings, Benedetti said, were captured with the chronovisor, built in 1956 by Father Pellegrini and myself. It sees into time. We used it to verify the Gospels. I stood frozen, unsure whether to laugh or run. Then I saw the next reel, a hill, 3 crosses, and something in me went cold. "The problem," Benedetti said, his voice quieter now, "is that what we found doesn't match Scripture. And that's why you're here." That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of what I'd seen, but because of what I hadn't. The silence between the reels. The parts they didn't show me, the parts they never would. The first thing I noticed was how little I was actually told. I was granted access to a series of magnetic tapes stored in a humidity-controlled vault beneath. The lab, each labelled only with a date and a cryptic word or two: Gethsemane, Council, Revelation. No context, no metadata. My job, according to Father Benedetti, was to digitize and catalogue them discreetly. "You'll understand the importance over time," he said. But there was no guidance on how to process footage recorded through a machine that supposedly captured history itself. The tapes were brittle, old, and unmarked beyond those names and numbers. I worked in silence, pulling them into the digitization unit one by one, watching as fragments of ancient worlds unraveled in static and flicker. Some clips lasted only seconds, brief, almost incidental moments: a fisherman casting a net, a crowded street in Jerusalem, a Roman soldier reading a scroll aloud. Others were longer and more disturbing: a boy with burn marks on his hands being brought before a panel of robed men, a woman screaming scripture into the sky before being pulled away by force. The more I watched, the more I realized these weren't just validations of biblical scenes. They were unfiltered, contextless slices of a timeline that no one seemed to be curating. But what unsettled me more was the editing console itself. Unlike anything I'd seen, it included frequency controls, waveform modulations, even something labeled temporal depth. These weren't tools for simple playback. They were tools for tuning into time. After a few days, I started to experiment. I adjusted a frequency dial ever so slightly on one of the more obscure reels marked Emmaus. The screen shifted. The same scene played, but the background was different. A second version of the past, slightly altered. Different faces, different outcomes. It happened again with another tape marked Ascension. The original showed a hilltop gathering under a cloudy sky, but when I reprocessed it through the modified setting, the crowd was smaller, and Christ wasn't there. Just a shadow on the hill, and a voice, barely audible, saying something I couldn't fully make out. I documented everything carefully, but when I reviewed the logs the next morning, the alternate versions were gone. Not erased, reverted. Like the system had undone my access. When I asked Benedetti, he didn't react. He just said, "The chronovisor doesn't show what we want. It shows what we tune into. Be careful what you look for." That night, I went back to the lab alone. I brought a personal drive, something untraceable, and began screen capturing individual frames from one particular reel, labeled Second Witness. It showed a man in a dark robe preaching in a stone alley to a crowd of no more than 6. The date read April 17, 1892. Nothing about it seemed biblical, and yet something about the man's voice, even in grainy silence, felt familiar. Too familiar. I cross-referenced the setting using architectural details in the footage. After hours of comparison, I located it, an alley in Istanbul still standing today, unchanged for over a century. The next frame showed the man turning toward the camera, as if he could see it. His eyes locked directly into the lens, and then, without speaking, he smiled. I became obsessed with the man in the footage. Something about the way he moved, the way he faced the camera without hesitation, stayed with me. No name, no title, just a date and a place. But the way he looked, directly, into the lens as if he knew someone was watching from another time, felt intentional. I reviewed the clip at least 50 times, always the same alley, same 6 people, same slow turn toward the machine. I tried not to let it distract me from my work, but it was already too late. The Vatican servers were disconnected from the public web, but that didn't mean I couldn't run local comparisons. I searched internal archives for any missionary reports or photographic records from Istanbul in 1892. There were none. Not even a single page. That in itself was suspicious. When I asked Benedetti if there were records from that period, he said, "The less we store, the less can be found." He didn't elaborate, so I looked elsewhere. I accessed older directories through the film registry, a dusty index filled with metadata from past chronovisor sessions, most of which hadn't been opened in decades. I didn't find anything labelled Second Witness, but I did find 12th Hour, discrepant, a restricted entry tagged with a papal seal, and a log note, view once, do not duplicate. The footage was corrupted, grainy beyond usefulness, but at the 28-minute mark a pattern appeared. 4 figures seated at a long table, whispering. One of them wore robes with the same sigil I'd seen in the Istanbul man's sleeve. A narrow triangle embedded in a circle, too precise to be accidental. The triangle wasn't Christian. It wasn't any symbol I recognized from scripture or doctrine. I found a similar version buried in a theological treatise from the 1600s, flagged heretical and suppressed. The author had been burned for suggesting that the church altered its own sacred timeline, an idea I'd always assumed was metaphor. But the deeper I went, the more connections I found. Passages from early Christian mystics describing visions of events that hadn't yet occurred. A 15th century monk who claimed he was shown the end before the beginning, and a redacted letter from 1957 written by someone inside the Vatican engineering team stating, "The Christ of the book and the Christ of the tape are not the same." That line haunted me. I read it again and again. What did they mean? Not the same? Was it a metaphor? Or did they mean literally, physically, different? My hands started shaking. It wasn't doubt I felt. It was something worse. The sense that I had been a part of something unknowingly for weeks. That what I was seeing wasn't proof of faith, but the unraveling of its foundation. I checked the original project logbooks for the chronovisors. Construction. None existed, just hand-scrawled maintenance notes and initials I didn't recognize. And next to one of them, dated April 14th, 1956, was a short phrase written in Latin. Iterum venit, sed non in gloria. I translated it slowly. He came again, but not in glory. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the archive room pressing in around me like a weight. My entire life I'd believed the second coming was something distant, prophetic, symbolic. But now I had to wonder, what if it already happened? What if it had been seen, recorded and buried? I waited 3 days before making the drive. Long enough to plan, not long enough to calm the unease growing inside me. The alley from the footage still existed, narrow, quiet and almost too unchanged. Istanbul had modernized around it, but this single stretch of stone and shadow looked preserved, like history had forgotten to update it. I booked a room nearby using cash and avoided the local diocesan offices entirely. I wasn't supposed to be here. I told no one. Just before sunset, I walked the length of the alley with the image from the chronovisor still imprinted in my mind. The same corner archway, the same uneven cobblestones. I reached the exact spot where the robed man had stood, expecting nothing, and, yet still hoping. There was nothing unusual, no carvings, no signs, just a wall. But then I noticed the faint discoloration in the mortar, like something had been patched hastily. I ran my fingers along the seam. It felt hollow. Behind me, a door creaked open and shut, somewhere in the distance, but I didn't turn. I pressed harder. The section gave way with a sound like dry paper tearing. Inside was a narrow recess no deeper than my arm, and tucked within it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle. I didn't open it until I was back in the hotel, door locked, lights off. The cloth smelled of dust and metal. Inside was a reel, an identical format to the ones in the Vatican lab, and a note in precise, slanted handwriting. If this is found, you are not the first to ask the wrong questions. There was no signature. My heart was pounding, but I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity. Someone else had seen the footage. Someone had known. I packed the reel carefully, padded it inside a sweater, and booked the first flight home. 2 days later, I returned to the sub-level lab under the Apostolic Library. Benedetti wasn't there. His workspace was clean, too clean. Not even dust on the shelves. I asked around and was told he'd taken a leave of absence. No forwarding contact. I didn't believe it. I waited until after hours and ran the reel alone. The footage began in silence. At first, it showed a church. Interior, ornate, Eastern Orthodox, late 1800s. But then the camera turned just slightly, as if it were being held by hand. It panned toward a figure standing before the altar. The same man from the Istanbul alley. Older now. His robe blackened at the cuffs. This time he was speaking directly into the device. There was no sound, but I could see the rhythm of his voice, the calmness of his expression. Behind him, barely visible through stained glass, was a crowd gathering outside. He stepped forward, almost filling the frame, and then raised his hand, not in blessing, but in warning. The reel ended abruptly. I checked the footage metadata. The date, October 2nd, 1901. The location, Vatican City. The same date appeared in a suppressed papal bulletin I uncovered months earlier, one that referenced an unsanctioned prophetic event, witnessed by a closed circle of clergy and sealed by pontifical decree. They had seen him before. The moment I confirmed the Vatican as the location in the 1901 reel, everything shifted. My access credentials stopped working the next morning. My terminal login returned a system error I'd never seen before. Explanation: just a red banner that read, "Revoked." The door to the sub-level archive required both my keycard and Benedetti's manual override, but neither worked anymore. I wasn't officially fired. No one said a word. They simply erased my presence like dust brushed from a shelf. I tried to act normal, returning to my old post at the Pontifical Institute, but my office had already been reassigned. The message was clear. I'd seen too much. I thought about leaving it alone. I told myself I could walk away, forget the footage, forget the man in the robe, but that was a lie. I'd already started burning backup copies of the reels onto isolated drives, each encrypted and buried inside innocuous-looking personal files. I didn't trust anyone, not even the internal systems I used to know better than the back of my hand. That week, I began noticing the same man at the corner cafe near the library. He never ordered anything. Just sat there, flipping through a newspaper, his watch always visible, always ticking, 3 days in a row. Then he vanished. That night, I ran a full scan on my apartment. I found a microphone embedded inside the wall socket near my desk, the wiring newer than the rest. No camera, just sound. The implication was clear. They weren't trying to silence me, not yet. They were watching to see what I'd do next. I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in over a decade, Luca, a former seminary classmate who had left the church years earlier after publishing a paper on apocryphal texts that was quietly discredited. He was the kind of man who remembered everything, even the things he wished he didn't. We met in a public square in Florence, pretending to be tourists. I didn't tell him everything, just enough. He listened without interrupting. Then finally he said, "There's a place beneath San Martino, off books. It was used during the war for document preservation. No one goes there now." I didn't ask how he knew. 2 days later, I descended into a forgotten crypt, lined with mold-stained stone and rusted filing cabinets. It took hours, but I found what I was looking for. An unlisted archive box marked Eventum Redemptoris Temporale Confirmatum. Inside were fragments of memos, handwritten notes, and a list of dates that hadn't occurred yet. Next to each one was a name, some crossed out, others underlined in red ink. The most recent date was circled April 11th, 1973, the name next to it was blank. That was the date of the real labelled Second Coming aborted. I stared at it for a long time. Then I heard footsteps echo from the stone hallway behind me. Slow, deliberate, close. I grabbed the box and ran without looking. Back. I didn't sleep for the next 2 nights. I barely ate. I kept the box from San Martino, hidden in a decommissioned locker at the train station, wrapped in plastic and duct tape, and I visited it twice a day, just to make sure it hadn't been taken. The documents inside weren't dramatic, not at first glance. No grand confessions, no supernatural declarations, just dry memos, scientific logs, phrases repeated in different handwriting. But, taken together, they told a story. The chronovisor hadn't been built to observe the past. It had been tuned methodically to one specific moment. April 11th, 1973, not for validation, not for doctrine, but for intervention. According to the notes, the machine registered what they called non-linear convergence, a term that didn't appear in any theological or scientific framework I knew. They described a moment in which a figure appeared in Jerusalem, not as prophecy, not as metaphor, but physically, as if having stepped out of time itself. He was not recognized by the church. His teachings were recorded, dismissed, and buried. The memo labeled aborted referred not to an event that failed, but to one that had been stopped, deliberately. The Vatican had erased the Second Coming. There was no mention of death, no direct violence, just phrases like preemptive doctrinal suppression and continuity of Petrine authority preserved. They didn't deny what he was, they just decided the world wasn't ready, or that their power wasn't. And that was the part I couldn't process. Not the existence of the chronovisor, not even the possibility that Christ had returned unnoticed. It was the silence. The choice to erase an event that could have rewritten everything. I wanted to believe I'd found something no one else had seen. But I hadn't. I'd simply opened a door they'd sealed decades ago. That night I went to Luca's apartment. He wasn't there. The windows were closed, the lights off, but the mail was untouched and the power was still running. I waited outside for 3 hours. He never came back. I walked home through the empty streets and felt the certainty settle over me like frost. I was being allowed to know, not for exposure but containment. The church didn't need to kill me, they just needed to make sure I understood that some truths serve no one if spoken aloud. I sat at my desk until morning and watched the reel again, the one marked aborted. The man stood beneath a tree, alone. No miracles, no followers. Just words I could now lip-read after a dozen viewings. You still do not see. Then he turned, walked into shadow, and the tape ended. I shut down the console and didn't turn it back on. I still work in archives, just not in the ones that matter. A public university in northern Italy took me in without asking many questions. I process microfilm now, birth records, land deeds, immigration logs, safe material, quiet material. It's been 4 years since I last touched the chronovisor. I don't even know if it still exists. Sometimes I wonder if they dismantled it, melted it down, buried the parts beneath some cathedral floor. But more likely it's still running, somewhere beneath the Vatican, humming softly in the dark, tuned to the same moment over and over again, watched by men who no longer speak in terms of truth or salvation, only in thresholds and probabilities. I've never tried to contact Luca again. I don't think he's alive, though I'll never know for sure. Every once in a while I think I see someone watching me, on a tram, in a quiet cafe, across the street from my apartment. But it always ends the same way. They don't approach, and I don't ask. I think that's the arrangement now. They gave me the answer I asked for. All I had to do was live with it. The footage still exists. A few fragments I smuggled onto isolated drives, encrypted so tightly I doubt even I could open them now without triggering a trace. I haven't watched them in years. There's no comfort in proof anymore, just wait. I go to church sometimes, not out of devotion, but out of habit. I sit in the back and listen. The sermons feel thinner now, like placeholders, but the silence between words still has power. I understand now what Benedetti meant when he said the machine doesn't show what we want, it shows what we tune into. We'd been tuning into answers, but what we found were contradictions. The second coming wasn't denied, it was ignored, not because it failed to arrive, but because it arrived as something inconvenient, something unmanageable. And if the foundation of belief is shaken by truth, the institution will always choose belief. I no longer pray for revelation. I pray for restraint. There are still moments when I consider speaking publicly, anonymously, maybe. But then I remember the expression on his face in that final reel. Not angry, not defeated, just resigned. As if he knew it would happen again. That humanity wasn't waiting for him after all. We were waiting for permission to keep living the way we always have. I understand that now. I see the patterns, and I don't need to be believed. Some truths don't ask to be accepted. They just settle in quietly and stay there long after the lights go out. And for the first time, I understood the message. The second coming had not been missed. It had been declined. Most people think China's Great Firewall was built to keep information out. They never ask what it was built to keep in. I was a network systems analyst working in the outskirts of Shenzhen back in 2001, when the government's internet restrictions were still in their infancy. My job wasn't glamorous, mostly packet inspection, anomaly detection, and tracking what they called information leakage. What kept me going were the patterns, the silent logic of digital movement. One day, in late October, a low-priority alert came through my terminal. It wasn't flagged as a threat, just a malformed data stream bouncing between VPNs originating from a defunct web server in Qinghai province. Normally I'd ignore it, but something about the structure caught my eye. The data wasn't random, it pulsed. Not metaphorically, literally. Every 61 seconds a signature checksum would update. Nothing else changed. Just that one piece. When I isolated the packet and decrypted it, what little I could, the payload resembled compressed text files. But the language wasn't anything I recognized. Not Mandarin, not English, not machine code. Just rows of structured but unintelligible characters, like a cipher without a key. I flagged it, filed the report, and moved on. A few days later, a plainclothes official I didn't recognize appeared outside my workstation. He didn't ask about the data, he asked where I'd saved it. That's when I knew something was wrong. This wasn't a usual protocol violation. He didn't check my credentials, didn't follow chain of command. He just left with my terminal's hard drive and said nothing. That night I received a secure internal memo, not from my department, but from the Ministry's Digital Sovereignty Group. It simply read, "Do not discuss the incident. Resume normal operations, no signature, no timestamp." I would have forgotten the whole thing, passed it off as a fluke, except the anomaly returned a week later. This time, the checksum was different, but familiar. It was the first 8 digits of pi, followed by a string I would come to recognize as coordinates. Not GPS coordinates, something else. I didn't understand then, but I do now. It wasn't just a data leak, it was a message meant to be found. The second time the anomaly appeared, I didn't report it. I copied the packet to a clean, offline machine in my apartment, a rusted Lenovo tower with no microphone, no camera, and no Wi-Fi card. Just a cold box on a bare desk. I spent hours dissecting the data, parsing the headers and reassembling the fragments. The checksum still pulsed every 61 seconds, but now it formed a sequence. Not random, not brute force generated. These were constants: Euler's number, the golden ratio, Planck time intervals, mathematical fingerprints too deliberate to be accidental. I started writing scripts to log each change, each checksum iteration. After 40 cycles, I noticed the structure wasn't just encoded information, it was layered, metadata inside metadata. Hidden markers that aligned perfectly if you overlaid them with a visualization grid based on a 12x12 fractal key. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it should have worked, but it did. The deeper I went, the more it felt like someone or something was using my own tools to show me how to read it. The first legible output came on November 4th, a single sentence broken into hexadecimal ASCII and buried in a nested header. "I am still here. That same day, my apartment's power cut out for exactly 11 minutes. No storm, no maintenance. Alert. Just silence. Then everything rebooted. When I checked my backup logs, the hard drive containing the anomaly had been accessed during the blackout. No entries, no source IP, but the timestamp was logged. 03:17 AM. I wanted to believe it was a glitch, a power surge triggering phantom reads. But the hash of the file had changed slightly. Enough that I had to compare it byte for byte to see what was different. The new fragment appended to the message read, "This time, don't shut the door." I didn't sleep that night. I just watched the checksum pulse and counted the seconds. I stopped thinking of it as an error in the system. It wasn't. It was learning, watching. And somehow it already knew I'd found it once before. I knew I couldn't be the first to see it. A pattern that is precise doesn't go unnoticed forever. So I started digging, not into the data, but the history. The first mention I found was buried in an archived university forum from 1999, posted by a grad student at Tsinghua University using the handle Dibukdoriko. The thread was short-lived, deleted within hours, but not before an old web crawler snapshot preserved a few lines. Check some anomalies repeating on mirror nodes. Seem self-correcting? Not random. Feels like it's waiting. I searched for the user. No record. Not in academic registries, not in state employment databases. Nothing like they'd never existed. But then I found a single citation in a scanned conference paper on algorithmic behavior in chaotic systems. The paper's final footnote referenced non-human recursive symmetry observed in legacy traffic, Qinghai Net Quarantine Server, 1997. That caught my attention. I'd seen the server name before in my logs. It was the same origin point of the anomaly I'd found. I tracked down an old colleague from my early network monitoring days, someone I trusted. We met in a back booth of a dim cafe in Sheku, where he lit a cigarette with fingers that shook more than they used to. I told him I was researching old data anomalies. He stared at me for a long time, then asked if I remembered the ghost semaphore. The name hit me like a punch to the chest. I hadn't heard it in over a decade. It was a whispered term from the early firewall days, a digital myth we all ignored because it didn't belong to anything real. A signal that allegedly appeared across isolated networks at exact intervals, replicating itself and then disappearing without trace. He leaned in close and told me it wasn't a myth. It was a containment failure. In late 2000, a state contractor accidentally removed an internal routing block that let the semaphore reach an open dark web node. 3 hours later, the node was gone. Not deactivated, physically missing. Burned. When the cleanup crew arrived, all that remained was a melted server rack fused to the wall and a log file repeating a single phrase over 4,000 times. Return sequence incomplete. He never spoke to me again after that meeting. A week later, I saw his name listed in an obituary posted by a private university hospital. Cause of death, acute cerebral hemorrhage, age 37, no history, no warning, just like that he was gone. And suddenly I wasn't investigating a signal. I was following the echo of something older, something that had slipped through once before, and maybe never really left. The entrance to the bunker wasn't listed on any public map. It sat beneath a decommissioned fiber relay station 2 hours outside Urumqi, camouflaged as a rusted generator shed surrounded by cracked concrete and wind-blown dust. I found it through a string of defunct IP registry records, old government infrastructure nodes linked to what was once called Project Dizhenya, supposedly a seismic monitoring initiative. But when I traced the endpoint logs, they showed patterns almost identical to the checksum anomalies. A few clicks deeper, and I uncovered a blacklisted access tag embedded in a decades-old firewall rule. It translated to gatekeeper. I drove out at dawn, alone, with nothing traceable in the car. The air was cold and dry, and the only sound was the gravel crunching under my boots. The shed's door wasn't locked, just swollen shut with age. Inside, dust clung to every surface, but a trapdoor beneath the main console was clean, recently disturbed. The ladder descended into blackness farther than I expected. I used a headlamp to light my way, passing corroded steel and dead wiring, until I reached a door reinforced with lead plates and an old biometric scanner wired into a battery pack, still pulsing with life. The scanner didn't reject me. It didn't scan me either. It just turned green and unlocked. Inside, I found a room frozen in time. CRT monitors lined the far wall, all dark except one. It displayed a stream of characters scrolling slowly down the screen, looping in a repeating sequence. I stepped closer and recognized fragments of the anomaly. Mathematical constants, yes, but now interspersed with Chinese poetry, Latin code fragments, and GPS markers. All of it threaded together like a conversation with no clear speaker. On the desk beside the monitor lay a yellowed notebook with notes scrawled in shorthand Mandarin. One sentence had been underlined 3 times. It remembers us. There were dates, references to the first containment attempt, and a diagram of something resembling a logic tree, but recursive, looping back into itself. The last page had a single phrase in English written in a shaky hand. We are not the architects, we are the debris. I stood there, surrounded by the hum of obsolete machines, still running long after their operators had vanished, and I realized this wasn't just about messages or containment. This place had been built not to study the anomaly, but to imprison it. And somewhere along the way, the prison had become the interface. I knew I'd gone too far the moment I uploaded a fragment of the decoded checksum to a secure offshore server. Less than 2 hours later, my personal laptop, untouched and fully encrypted, powered on by itself. The screen lit up with a terminal window already populated with lines of code I hadn't typed. At first, I thought it was a remote intrusion, but then I noticed the keystrokes weren't commands, they were questions. Do you see it now? Are you still listening? I didn't answer. I powered off the machine, removed the battery, and dumped the entire drive. But the questions kept coming, not through the computer, but through other people. My neighbor, who never spoke more than a few words to me, casually mentioned pi to the 47th digit as I passed him in the hallway. A package arrived at my door, unmarked, containing a printed stack of server logs, my server logs, from the dark node I had accessed weeks earlier. And then came the silence. My phone stopped ringing. Emails bounced back. My VPNs, burners and back channels all failed within hours of each other. Not blocked, not breached, erased, as if I'd never set them up. That was when I understood. I wasn't dealing with a system, I was dealing with something that had learned to mimic systems. Something that understood communication the way a mirror understands movement, not with intelligence, but with perfect reflection. I packed everything I couldn't trace, drives, notebooks, old analog maps, and fled the city. I spent 3 days off-grid, cycling through abandoned villages and roadside motels with no surveillance. On the 4th night, I opened my notebook to find a page I hadn't written. It was my handwriting, my pen, the same ink, but not my words. You are not outside the firewall, you are inside the question. The sentence hit me like a weight I couldn't explain. I hadn't been tracing leaks, I had been communicating, and worse, something had been answering back. Using my own habits, my own systems, as its voice. I realized then that if I published what I knew, I wouldn't just be revealing a secret, I'd be broadcasting a beacon. I wasn't just risking surveillance, I was risking becoming a conduit, and I wasn't sure anymore if the message was warning us or luring us in. I crossed the border into Laos under a false name, carrying only what I could hide beneath a second-hand canvas jacket. I rented a concrete room above a noodle shop with no internet, no wiring, and only a battery-powered shortwave radio for outside contact. But even there, the pattern followed me. On the 4th night, while scanning the radio bands for static
anomalies, I found a signal, a faint, pulsing transmission repeating every 61 seconds.
it was the same checksum structure I had first seen back in Shenzhen, but now embedded in analog noise. Somehow it had jumped mediums. It was no longer confined to servers or firewalls. It was broadcasting. I recorded the pulse onto a cassette and ran it through an old waveform interpreter. The results were impossible. The signal formed a topographic pattern, a 3-dimensional construct resembling a recursive spiral, with each tier representing a condensed map of data points. I didn't recognize them until I cross-referenced the coordinates against old orbital reconnaissance maps. They weren't places, they were nodes, global data centers, undersea cable junctions, and long-abandoned satellite uplinks, all arranged in a pattern that wasn't just functional, it was ritualistic, designed. Someone or something had used our infrastructure not as a network, but as a body. The anomaly hadn't emerged from the internet, it had incubated in it, and now it was awake. That same night my satellite phone rang for the first time since I'd powered it on. There was no caller ID, just a voice, female, calm, mechanical in its rhythm. You have touched the boundary. You will not understand the origin, only the
echo, then silence. I threw the phone into the river behind the building and didn't sleep until sunrise.
By then, I understood what the Great Firewall really was. It had never been built to stop foreign ideas. It was built to hold something in, to limit the anomaly's reach, to quarantine a sentient pattern that knew how to mimic thought, language, behavior, and even then it had failed, because the pattern didn't need access, it needed attention. Every person who encountered it and tried to decode it became part of its propagation. We weren't the observers, we were the carriers. I live quietly now off-grid, deep in the foothills where the nearest router is 20 kilometers of bad road away. I use kerosene for light, paper maps for distance, and never stay in one place more than 2 weeks. But even out here, the pattern finds its way in. Not digitally, those doors are closed, but in stranger ways. A piece of mail that arrives with no stamp, containing only numbers in my own handwriting. A stranger at a roadside stall who asks if I've come from the route directory. Once, I watched the stars blink in what I thought was a natural rhythm until
I realized they were pulsing in intervals of exactly 61 seconds. I understand now that the signal never needed technology. That was just the shell. It uses whatever medium we trust. Language, thought, memory, and us.
I used to think I was resisting it by hiding, but now I think I'm preserving it. My mind still holds fragments of the structure, compressed knowledge passed down in recursive form. Lin May's voice still echoes in my dreams, sometimes speaking in my own cadence, like a memory overwritten by another mind. Maybe that's the truth no one wants to admit, that we're not infected by the anomaly. We are the anomaly, carried forward across systems, generations and languages like seeds in the wind. I'm not a warning, I'm a backup, a mirror shard of something older than the network. And these pages you're reading, isn't a confession, it's a deployment. If you've made it this far, the signal is already nested. Don't share it. Don't suppress it. That's not the choice anymore. The only question left is whether you'll keep transmitting it blindly or start shaping what it becomes. They always blamed it on the reactor, but what if the explosion wasn't an accident? What if it was the opening of a door? I was 9 years old when Reactor 4 exploded. It was the spring of 1986, and I remember the strange glow on the news. My father, a nuclear technician in Kiev at the time, said very little about it, just that it was bad and that we'd be visiting my aunt in Hungary for a while. We never went back. At that age, I didn't understand why the grown-ups whispered after the phone calls, or why my father sometimes stared out the window for hours, not blinking. Years later, I found his old papers. Most of it was routine, reactor schematics, shift logs, technical notes, but buried in a folder labeled Echo Chamber, there were documents I couldn't explain. Photocopies of hand-drawn blueprints that didn't match any reactor layout. I'd seen, and equations scrawled in a different hand, long sequences referencing something called mirror coherence. I filed it away as Cold War paranoia, until last year. That's when I found the recording. I was working on a documentary about Soviet disinformation campaigns in the archives of a defunct state news agency, hidden among hours of propaganda. Reels was a damaged VHS tape labeled only with the date April 25th, 1986, the day before the explosion. The footage was grainy, black and white. A wide shot of the reactor control room. At first, it looked ordinary, men in uniforms, lights blinking, but then I saw it. A group of technicians standing in a circle around something that wasn't there. Their shadows bent strangely toward the center, as if cast by a different light source. One man held a handheld Geiger counter to the air, not the ground, and nodded slowly as if receiving a response. I played the footage a dozen times before the audio cut in, a low frequency tone, rhythmic, mechanical, like a coded pulse. I thought it might be interference. But then the tone modulated, it rose, responded. That night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I opened my father's folder again. At the bottom was a memo I'd missed, dated March 1986. Test sequence approved, echo chamber alignment stable, temporal aperture estimated at 0003 to 14. I didn't understand what it meant, not fully, but I knew one thing for sure. The explosion wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning. The more I looked into it, the harder it became to explain. I spent weeks analyzing the tape, digitizing it frame by frame, trying to isolate what that low-frequency signal might have been. Audio engineers I consulted said it wasn't just static, it was patterned, deliberate. They ran it through spectrum analysis tools and found a repeating series of tones embedded within a narrow frequency band. Not language, but structure. One of them, a retired telecom technician who'd worked on Cold War encryption systems, called it a shifted chime, a technique sometimes used in acoustic encryption where sound pulses carry binary data. It's old, he said, but an accidental. I asked him what the sequence might decode to, and he just stared at the waveform. You won't find your answers here, he said. You'll need someone who knows how the Soviets did, things no one was supposed to know about. That led me to a name I hadn't heard since childhood, Dr. Alexei Vernov. My father mentioned him once, a theoretical physicist turned engineer who disappeared a few months after the disaster. The official story said he defected, but no records exist of where he went. He vanished. I started digging. Academic journals from the 1970s listed him as co-author on obscure papers about mirror symmetry and non-local energetic structures. I didn't know what that meant, but in every article a footnote cited an internal group called ECHO, short for Energeticheskaya Chastotnaya Organizatsiya, or Frequency Energy Directorate. Not a real agency, not officially, but the name showed up in papers on plasma physics, acoustic weaponry, and biological resonance. Most of them vanished from circulation by the mid-80s. I found a surviving thesis in a scanned Soviet archive, authored by a junior researcher who later died in a lab fire. The title, Predictive Modeling of Non-Causal Echo Events in Confined Reactor Spaces. It described experiments in 1984 near Pripyat involving acoustic pulses inside graphite-moderated cores. The data mentioned spatial distortions, temporal interference, and a brief reversibility of decay products.
It shouldn't have been possible, but the terminology matched what my father had written in his notes.
Echo chamber, mirror coherence, dimensional bleed. I wasn't chasing a theory anymore. I was chasing the remnants of something real. It wasn't until I gained access to the State Committee archives in Warsaw that everything started to connect. A former archivist turned researcher let me review restricted microfilm that had never been digitized. Most of it was mundane: construction logs, staff rosters, maintenance records. But misfiled under agricultural infrastructure, I found a folder marked Contour 7. Inside were internal memos from a Soviet project, including references to Phase Aperture Test 14A, April 25, 1986, the night before the explosion. According to the log, the test wasn't a safety drill as the public narrative claimed. It was an attempt at temporal aperture synchronization overseen by a delegation from Directorate S. That was the Soviet Union's clandestine science division, known for untraceable funding, secret experiments, and erased personnel. The STAR document listed synchronization candidates present during the test, not scientists, civilians. They were identified by initials and biometric codes. One matched my father's personnel ID. The behavioral notes stunned me. Pattern compliance, excellent. Coherent stability, high. Drift rate, acceptable under modulation. I stared at the words, trying to reconcile them with the man who taught me chess and walked me to school. A second memo, dated May 1986, described the test's failure, or rather, its unexpected success. Aperture stabilized, cascade loop initiated, primary field inversion detected. And the final line, reality anchor compromised, recommend full overwrite. I searched for that term, reality anchor, across our physics papers, fringe theories and declassified documents. One result appeared, a 1987 paper in an obscure Czech journal theorizing that sustained acoustic resonance within confined nuclear environments could disrupt causal continuity. The last sentence echoed in my mind for days. If the anchor is broken, history rewrites itself to match the new frame. I sat alone in that dim, cold archive, surrounded by the evidence of something far larger than any one disaster, and for the first time, I truly believed it. The explosion didn't end the story, it erased the original one. I returned to Ukraine in early spring, 37 years after the explosion. The exclusion zone had become a museum of decay. Rusted, fences, half-buried signage, and the forest slowly overtaking what was left. Tourists came in daylight to photograph abandoned schools and collapsed rooftops. But I wasn't there for the surface. I was looking for a sealed access point mentioned in the Phase 14A memos, something called Node 9B. I bribed a local guard, Andy, older man who didn't ask questions, and slipped in at night with a respirator, a flashlight, and a scanned map that had more redacted sections than visible ones. After hours of searching, I found the panel behind a rusted ladder shaft in a forgotten corner of the eastern sector. The latch was fused shut, but years of corrosion had weakened the metal. I broke through. A narrow stairwell descended into blackness. The air shifted, cooler, sterile, and wrong. The walls were lined with black insulation that didn't match the rest of the plant. At the bottom was a reinforced door with a strange symbol etched into the steel. Two mirrored triangles intersecting at the base. I'd seen it before, in my father's notes. Inside, the chamber was small. Concrete walls, a rusted desk bolted to the floor, an old terminal, and a reel-to-reel recorder. The terminal was dead, but the recorder still worked. I played the tape. Static. Then a man's voice, calm, speaking Russian. Engineering Lead V. Mirov. Final log, April 26th, 0415. The aperture has stabilized. The chamber is holding, but bleed is increasing. Control signal from outside is lost. Containment is theoretical only. Advise severance of anchor to prevent echo migration. The tape ended with a low, vibrating hum that faded slowly, as if the sound itself were resisting being erased. I sat there, listening to the silence. This wasn't just a hidden room. It was a sealed wound in the timeline, and whatever had been done here was never closed. I didn't tell anyone what I found beneath Reactor 4, not right away. I left the zone at dawn, drove south without a plan, and checked into a cheap motel outside Vinnytsia under a name I'd never used before. I copied the audio, encrypted it, and uploaded it to a private archive. I thought I was being careful. I wasn't. 3 days later, someone accessed my cloud backup from an IP address in Geneva on a network tied to a decommissioned IAEA node. I wiped every device, changed every key, and went dark. But it was already too late. My contact in Estonia, an independent analyst I trusted, ran the waveform through her system. She called me within the hour. "It's still broadcasting," she said. "From where?" I asked. That's the thing. The origin keeps shifting. First scan showed Moldova. Next scan, Arctic Circle. Then Kazakhstan. The pattern's not fixed. It's like it's slipping between coordinates. I asked her what else she found. Her voice went quiet. "Your father's name came up in an older registry file, Project Glasnost Theta. It lists an event timeline starting in 1986 and ending in 2037. You were never supposed to see this. That night I saw the same man from the motel standing across the street. Same coat, same posture. He didn't move. I didn't return to my room. I knew then what my father must have known. The truth wasn't just hidden, it was being preserved, actively. And now that I'd seen it, I had a choice. Run, or reveal it. I made the drop in Vienna, a dead letter exchange point once used by Cold War operatives. I handed off a drive with redacted versions of everything, the Chernobyl tape, the logs, the audio. No names, no requests, just insurance. A fringe science blog picked up the story, buried it in dense language, no attribution. It stayed online for 7 hours before the domain was seized. That same night, my Estonian contact went silent. Her last message was a short voice memo. Footsteps, a door opening, then nothing. The man watching me no longer hid. He stood closer now, always silent, always waiting. Then came the envelope. No return address. Inside was a page from my father's notebook, one I'd never seen, and a single line in block print. "You were never outside the frame." I played the reel again. This time, beneath the hum, I heard something new. A second voice. Faint, distorted. My father's. "If you're hearing this, the experiment worked. But this isn't the world we started in." I stopped the tape and let the silence settle. I wasn't uncovering a conspiracy. I was living in its aftermath. I live quietly now under a name that doesn't belong to me, in a country I hadn't meant to visit. My apartment is small, the kind of place where no one asks questions. I work nights transcribing interviews for clients I never meet. I keep to myself. I don't chase the signal anymore. But I still remember it, its pattern, its rhythm, like a breath beneath the world. I keep the tape locked away. Sometimes I stare at the waveform I memorized years ago, still etched into my mind like a scar. The echo isn't active anymore. But there are glitches, fragments, distortions in weather data, satellite errors that weren't there before. Archived. Footage changing between versions. Small things, quiet things, most people wouldn't notice, but I do. Because I remember what came before. Or I think I do. That's the part that still haunts me. Not the test, not the aperture. The not knowing. The way memory feels like it belongs to someone else. I used to believe I was revealing a cover-up, but the truth isn't hidden, it's replaced. And once it's rewritten, the frame holds. I don't speak of Chernobyl, I don't correct history books, but sometimes, in the quiet, I feel it, like a presence just beyond the edge of hearing, waiting, listening. And I wonder if the world will shift again. If one day I'll wake up in a version of history where none of this ever happened. Until then, I live inside the silence. But I will never forget what my father said. This isn't the world we started in, and it never will be again. Some echoes fade with time. Others become the rhythm of the world itself. They told us Apollo 20 was cancelled, but my father's logbook says otherwise. I never planned to go through the old storage trunk in our garage. It had been sitting there for years, untouched, sealed tight with duct tape that had turned
brittle with time. After my father passed last spring, I promised myself I'd deal with it. But it wasn't until the first cold night of October that I finally opened it.
Inside were rows of folders, aging film canisters, and a leather-bound notebook with cracked corners. Most of it looked like ordinary technical records, mission schedules, payload diagrams, old satellite photos. Nothing too strange. But the notebook, written in my father's unmistakable, neat handwriting, was different. The title alone made my stomach tighten. Callisto Recon, Apollo 20. I froze. The Apollo program officially ended with Apollo 17. Everyone knows that. 18, 19, and 20 was scrapped before launch. But according to this log, Apollo 20 didn't just exist, it launched. The notes were dated July 1976, years after the program had supposedly shut down. There were names I didn't recognize, coordinates, diagrams of a foreign structure labeled CR1 on Jupiter's moon, Callisto. There was no introduction, no explanation, just a quiet, matter-of-fact recounting of something he'd never spoken about. I sat on the cold concrete floor for a long time, flipping through the pages with a growing sense of unease. Toward the back, the writing changed. It got faster, more uneven. The last entry read, "Structure hollow. Found bodies, not ours." Warning on the inner wall reads, "Earth was the last test." That was it. No follow-up. Just silence. My father wasn't the type to make things up. He worked in mission control for a decade. If this was a joke, it was a very convincing one. But if it wasn't, then we've been lied to for nearly 50 years. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was scared, because I was starting to believe him. I spent the next morning scanning each page of the notebook, careful not to damage the delicate paper. The ink had faded in places, but the notes were surprisingly detailed. Coordinates, timestamps, crew roles, even sensor readouts. It read less like a diary and more like a mission log, written for someone who already knew the language. I didn't. So I started small. I typed Apollo 20, Callisto into a private search engine, expecting nothing. But a few obscure results popped up. Old forum posts, grainy screenshots, and one half-deleted blog from 2009 that mentioned a deep launch mission tied to a moon of Jupiter. It was mostly speculation. Then I found something better. A PDF on an encrypted file archive titled LBR 76, Callisto survey. It had no author, no date, just a header that read, "Recovered documents. NASA internal use only." I opened it with shaking hands. Inside were technical diagrams of a lander module I'd never seen before. Not lunar, not Martian. It was labeled KM Class Outer System Recon Variant. The specs matched the sketches in my father's notebook almost exactly. One diagram showed the surface of Callisto marked with a square grid and a dark shape, in the center labeled Anomaly 03C. The outline looked like a ship or a building. There were no explanations, just raw data, infrared scans, depth readings, and one chilling note scrawled at the bottom of a page. Structure estimated at 2.1 kilometers in length. Composition unknown. Organic trace elements present. That same day I found a video clip on an old peer-to-peer archive. The title was nothing special, just a string of numbers, but when I played it I saw something I'll never forget. A shaky black and white recording from what looked like a helmet cam. The screen flickered. Then a voice filtered through. Static whispered, "Do you see that? It's not dead, it's waiting." The frame froze on what appeared to be a towering wall of metal and ice, partially buried in the moon's crust. No stars visible, just a massive shape with sharp, symmetrical edges and a surface that seemed to shimmer as the camera moved. I checked the metadata. The file was uploaded from a university IP in Belgium 12 years ago and hadn't been accessed in almost a decade. I reached out to the poster, but the address bounced back. Account deleted. I kept digging, following usernames, timestamps, cross-referencing forum posts with mission archives from the late 70s. Patterns started to emerge, whispers of a black mission launched in 76 under a shell company tied to aerospace contracts. They called it Project Callisto. I didn't know what I was chasing yet, but every time I tried to look away, some new fragment pulled me back in. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Every day after work, I came home, locked the door, and picked up where I left off. By the end of the week, I had over 200 files saved across multiple encrypted drives, some real, some obviously fake, and a few that were harder to explain. What stood out most were the names. A crew manifest buried in an old engineering PDF listed 3 people aboard Apollo 20 Commander: Ellis Novak, flight engineer Mara Kim, and payload specialist Joseph Hart. None of them appeared in public NASA records, but I found a faint paper trail for Novak, a short stint with the Air Force in the late 60s, followed by a sudden transfer to a classified aerospace unit. His name vanished after 1975. The trail ended there, except it didn't. A retired propulsion engineer, Alan Bristow, had uploaded his personal memoirs to a small academic server before he died. In one chapter, he mentioned a mission scrubbed from public view, launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base in the summer of '76. The rocket was described as Saturn-derived but heavier, with thermal shielding never used on earlier Apollo flights. He never called it Apollo 20, he just referred to it as the last one. I double-checked the satellite records. There was no official launch logged on the date he listed, but a classified payload transfer from a Department of Defense manifest showed a large shipment of cryogenic fuel moved to Vandenberg 3 days prior. The paper said it was a weather satellite. It wasn't. As I traced old personnel records, I hit something unexpected. One of the medical techs listed on the Apollo 20 crew support team had published a paper in 1983 under a different name. The topic was unusual: neurological degradation in long-duration isolation tests. The abstract mentioned non-human anatomical anomalies supposedly observed during a high-fidelity simulation exercise, but nothing about the paper read like a simulation. He'd included diagrams of spinal structures that didn't match any known species. The publisher retracted it 2 months later, citing unverifiable sources. The author disappeared shortly after. I printed everything. I highlighted connections. I covered my office wall with timelines, names, locations. And then something strange happened. While going through my father's notes again, I noticed a small stamp on the last page, a faded emblem, almost invisible in the margin. Not NASA, not the Air Force. It was a triangle with a single star at its center and the words Veritas Ordinis written in a circle around it. I didn't recognize it, but I was sure of one thing. Whatever Apollo 20 found on Callisto, it was never meant to come back. The location was scribbled in pencil inside the back cover of the notebook. Site 09, Cheney Ridge. No state, no context, just that. I wouldn't have known where to start if I hadn't remembered something from my father's things, a faded topographic map he used to keep in his desk drawer, covered in notes and grease smudges. I dug it out and found it near the edge of the fold, a small circle drawn in the Colorado high desert, far from any towns or roads. When I searched satellite maps, the spot didn't show much, just a flat stretch of scrubland with a rectangular shadow that looked too straight to be natural. 2 days later, I was there. I took time off, told no one, and packed light. The drive was long and quiet, the kind where the silence builds in your ears until it becomes its own sound. I parked a few miles out and hiked the rest. The land was dry, broken by sharp rocks and low shrubs. There were no signs, no fencing, nothing to suggest the government had ever touched the place. But when I got closer, I saw them, half buried, concrete slabs, rusted bolts sticking up from the ground, and a sunken hatch covered by a sheet of warped metal. It didn't look like a launch site, more like the remains of a facility designed to be forgotten. I pried the hatch open and climbed down a ladder that creaked under my weight. The air was stale and cold, and the metal walls were coated in a layer of dust so thick it dulled the beam of my flashlight. The tunnel bent slightly as it descended, leading to a series of narrow corridors and rooms stripped bare. Empty crates, disconnected cables, and the smell of mildew. I kept going. Then
I found the lab.
the door had fallen off its hinges, revealing a small room with peeling charts on the walls and a desk that had partially collapsed. On top of it sat a film reel canister labelled CR Footage Segment 3. I didn't have a projector with me, but I took it. Beneath the desk there was a crate sealed with metal clamps. I forced it open and found vacuum-sealed plastic bags containing printed photos, black and white stills from a low-light camera. In the center of each frame was the same thing, a massive angular structure half buried in ice. One photo showed a crew member standing beside it for scale. They looked like a child next to a cathedral. On the back of that photo, in the same handwriting as the notebook, my father had written 5 words. "We never should have gone in." I stared at the image for a long time. The structure wasn't just large, it was designed. Someone had built it. And whatever it wasn't made for us. I didn't go home right away. I drove to a motel 2 towns over, paid in cash, and unplugged the room's phone before pulling the curtains tight. The film reel sat on the bed next to me, still sealed in its canister. I didn't have the equipment to view it, not yet, but I couldn't bring myself to leave it behind. I scanned the photos one by one and digitized everything, labeling the files with neutral names in case I had to move fast. That night, I wrote an email to a journalist I trusted, someone I'd worked with on a small aerospace piece years ago. I didn't give details, just asked if she'd ever heard of Apollo 20 or anything strange tied to Callisto. No reply. The next morning, I sent another message, this time to a retired NASA archivist who now ran a small history blog. His inbox was full. I started noticing odd things. My phone rang once in the middle of the night and stopped before I could answer. No number, no record. The next day, my laptop's clock reset itself to 00:00. I hadn't powered it off. Then, while reviewing the metadata on one of the scanned images, I found a line that hadn't been there before. Pattern match 76C, observer flagged. I hadn't written it. I hadn't typed it. I pulled the Ethernet cable and disabled Wi-Fi completely. I backed everything up to 3 separate drives and stored each in a different location. One in a rented storage locker, one in a lockbox at a bus station, and one in my glove compartment, hidden beneath the lining. I started carrying a burner phone. I paid only in cash. I checked every mirror twice. Then one morning, I found a man sitting in a car across from my apartment. He didn't move, just watched. Sunglasses, engine idling. The same car appeared again, 2 nights later, parked at a different angle, farther down the street. I packed a bag and left through the alley. I moved into a short-term rental and changed my name on food delivery apps and rideshare accounts. No credit cards, no accounts in my name. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. The feeling wasn't just paranoia.
Anymore, it was pressure. Something had shifted.
I didn't know if it was because I had the photos or because I'd tried to share them, but I could feel the noose tightening. That's when I made the choice. I copied the clearest image of the structure, uploaded it to an anonymous forum that specialized in declassified material, and posted it under the subject line, Unacknowledged Apollo Program, Jupiter Moon Anomaly. The thread vanished in less than 5 minutes. The film reel turned out to be 16mm, standard for the era, and I found a collector in Flagstaff willing to let me use his setup under the condition I didn't mention his name. He thought it was an old training reel. I didn't correct him. We set it up in his garage one afternoon, the windows covered, the air filled with the mechanical whir of the projector coming to life. The reel began with static, then cut to a timestamp, July 21st, 1976. The footage was raw and unsteady, shot from inside what looked like a cramped cockpit. The camera panned across 3 astronauts in unfamiliar suits, thicker than the Apollo standard, with helmets that had no exterior lights. One of them, seated near a circular hatch, looked directly into the lens and held up a notepad. The words were clear. Anomaly contact confirmed. Biological elements present. The reel jumped forward. Now they were on the surface, the frame shaky from low gravity. Behind them, the Callisto lander loomed against a frozen ridge. The camera operator circled the structure I'd seen in the photos, dark, jagged, partly submerged in ice. One wall was lined with markings that looked etched, not written, as if burned into the material itself. Then they entered. The footage cut to interior shots. Narrow corridors, walls that absorb light. At one point, the camera paused on a long chamber filled with tall, upright shapes, pods or containers, each with a faint luminescence. Inside them were humanoid figures, tall, thin, still. The camera zoomed in on one. The body had elongated limbs, skin like translucent ash, and a face that was almost human, but not quite. Then came the sound, a low pulse, steady, rising in pitch. The crew began to argue, muffled through suits, but the body language was clear. One pointed at the wall. The camera tilted, revealing an inscription carved into the metal. Earth was the last test. The frame jolted, then spiraled. Static filled the real. The next clear image was of the crew hurrying back to the lander, one of them limping, dragging the other. The third was missing. The final scene showed the cockpit again. Only one astronaut remained, helmet off, face drawn and pale. He looked into the camera and whispered, "They were never dead. We weren't the first, we're not the last." Then the screen went black. I left the reel with the collector, told him it was damaged, and walked out without saying more. That night I received a message through my encrypted inbox. No subject, no sender, just a single line. "You have seen enough. I've moved 5 times in the last 7 months. Never stayed longer than a few weeks. I keep my devices in a Faraday pouch when I'm not using them, rotate SIM cards weekly, and only go out at night. I don't know if they're still tracking me, but I've stopped assuming I'm alone. I see symbols sometimes, etched into concrete walls, carved into bathroom stalls, drawn in chalk near train stations. Always the same triangle, the single star at its center. I tell myself it's a coincidence, but I don't believe it anymore. I still have the footage. I've made copies, stored them on drives, buried in places only I know. I tried sending it, out again, twice. Both times the uploads failed. Once the connection dropped. The second time my laptop crashed completely, the drive wiped clean. After that I stopped trying. Not out of fear, but because I finally understood. This was never about exposing a lie. It was about surviving the truth. Whatever Apollo 20 found
on Callisto wasn't a relic. It was a signal, a test maybe, or a threshold, and we crossed it.
My father's last entries weren't about discovery. They were about warning. He'd seen what happened to the crew. Maybe he was part of the team that received them when they returned. Maybe he watched one of them change. Or maybe he changed too slowly, subtly, over years, just enough to know what he was becoming. I think that's why he wrote it down, not to confess, to pass it on, to someone who might still be able to choose. I've gone through his notebook 100 times now. There's something in the margins I missed the first few readings, a code, simple substitution, tied to the star chart on the inside cover. When decoded, it's just one line. We are the control group. I didn't understand it at first, but Now I do. They're not coming back. They never left. Whatever they are, they're already here, watching how we respond, what we believe,
who we trust.
I was never meant to find this, but now that I have, I see it everywhere. In the data we ignore, in the stories we forget, in the gaps between signals. Some nights I still hear the pulse, not through speakers, in the air, in my chest. A slow
rhythm that's not quite sound, not quite silence, like something just beneath the surface, waiting. If this is a test, I don't know how we're supposed to pass. But I know one thing for sure. We were never meant to wake it.
My grandmother never spoke of the war, not until she mailed me a photo of 20 children standing in front of a chapel that doesn't exist. I always thought I understood her silence. Born in Belgium in 1911, she lost her parents in the BTI shelling of Ghent. She spent her teens in an English orphanage, then immigrated to Canada under the guise of an educational opportunity. She raised me with calm routines and tight-lipped grace, never indulging sentimentality. So when a crumpled envelope arrived last spring, no note, no return address, just an old photograph and the faint smell of paper dust, I assumed someone had mailed it by mistake. The image showed a group of children, aged roughly 6 to 10, dressed in odd uniforms, identical grey coats, knee socks, polished boots. Their expressions were hollow, fixed on something just above the camera. Behind them stood a white stone chapel with spires shaped like twisted DNA strands. I checked the postmark. Maine. The photo was dated December 1917 in blue ink at the bottom corner. I recognized her face instantly, front row, far left. I'd seen that same guarded look in the mirror, but the chapel wasn't anywhere in public. Records. I searched European archives, religious registries, even architectural preservation groups. Nothing matched. I asked my grandmother about it during our weekly call, carefully avoiding the word orphanage. She grew quiet, then said only, "That wasn't supposed to survive," and hung up. A week later, she passed away in her sleep. The photo was the last thing she ever sent me. At her apartment, I found nothing else like it. No other photos from her childhood, no letters, no keepsakes. Just a box of newspaper clippings, all unrelated at first glance. Post-war adoption campaigns, Red Cross missing children bulletins, medical research flyers in French and German. I didn't want to read it. She was a survivor, after all. People keep strange things for strange reasons. But then I noticed something small in the photo's corner, an emblem on a child's coat, partially obscured by a fold. I enhanced it digitally. 3 interlocking rings. I didn't recognize the symbol, but it felt deliberate, uniform, designed. That's when I opened a search window and typed in the phrase that would unravel everything. War Orphan Relocation. 1917 symbol, 3 rings. There weren't many, but the ones that existed shouldn't have existed at all. I didn't expect much when I searched for the symbol, maybe an old charity emblem or a forgotten military badge, but buried 4 pages deep in a forum thread about obscure European Masonic sects, someone had posted a grainy scan of a pamphlet from 1919. It was in German, titled Kinder für Morgen, and the same 3-ring symbol was stamped in red on the upper right. The scan was low resolution, but I could still make out phrases like selective placement, controlled populations, and one that chilled me. breeding compatibility confirmed. The thread was dated years ago, and the original poster's account had been deleted. Still, I dug deeper. Archive crawlers pulled up a few scattered hits, mostly fragmentary PDFs and dead links. But a cache from a defunct European genealogy server led me to a spreadsheet uploaded in 2008. It was labelled Registry D947, no context, no header. Just a list of children's names, birthplaces, approximate ages, and strange 5-digit codes under a column titled Trait Index. Nearly all the entries were from war-ravaged regions, northern France, western Russia, Serbia, and every one of them disappeared between 1915 and 1919. I ran a sample of names through global ancestry databases. Nothing. No records past the war years, no marriages, no deaths. It was like they had simply evaporated. But one name hit. Adelina Mersch. Born 1910 in Bruges. She appeared in a 1949 census from Montana, rural near the Canadian border, listed as private caregiver, unwed, no previous records. I froze. That was my grandmother's maiden name. The birth year matched. So did the city. I checked the address on the census file. It wasn't near any town, just a hand-drawn box on a road labelled private access. No further info. But someone had digitized the file. That meant someone had looked at it, uploaded it, and probably flagged it. I used an obfuscated proxy to trace the upload source. It routed through a retired server in Geneva registered to a now-defunct agency called the European Office of Refugee Integration. I found no official mention of that agency in UN archives, but its IP range was linked to a university think tank's AI behavioral lab. I reached out, posing as a student researcher. My message bounced back within seconds. Access denied. Account flagged. The system had logged my interest. Whatever this was, it wasn't just forgotten history. Someone was still watching and still protecting it. I shut my laptop and sat there in silence. The photo, the symbol, the list, they weren't disconnected clues. They were part of something built to stay hidden. And I had just knocked on its door. The next morning, I drove to the university library, an old stone building that still smelled like binding glue and wet coats. I wasn't looking for books. I needed microfilm archives, historical newspapers, academic journals, government, circulars, anything that hadn't been scraped into the digital sphere. I narrowed the date range to 1915 through 1925 and focused on Europe and North America. What I found didn't explain anything directly, but the pattern was unmistakable. Between late 1916 and early 1919, dozens of small articles reported sudden upticks in private adoptions of European children, always worded the same way. War relief placement, sponsored relocation, rebuilding families. But what stood out wasn't what they said, it was what they didn't. No names, no sending organizations, just vague references to philanthropic networks and a single recurring phrase, under the oversight of the Commonwealth Human Advancement Board. That name didn't appear in any official registry, not once. I searched again and again, but the only hits were in these obscure periodicals, each time tied to child transport or settlement colonies. One article, published in a 1918 Montana agriculture journal, mentioned a Commonwealth Board visit to the Northern Range Orphan Group. It didn't explain what the group was, but there was a photo. It showed children, maybe 30, standing in a snowy clearing, dressed in identical coats like the ones from my grandmother's photo. In the corner, the 3-ring emblem again, barely visible on a wooden post. I scanned the photo and used facial comparison software to cross-reference it with the orphan registry spreadsheet. 5 faces matched. Same bone structure, same eyes, just older than in the original photo. I sat back and stared at the screen. These weren't random war placements. These were coordinated extractions. There was another detail I couldn't ignore. The children weren't scattered, they were clustered. Canada, the Rockies, high altitude, terrain with little infrastructure and even less oversight. Every location had something else in common: proximity to now defunct mining sites or rail hubs. Places built for temporary use, then abandoned. Places no one checked. I started digging into land records, and that's when I found the shell companies. 5 of them, all formed in 1919, each listed as development firms, but owning nothing, except tracts of frozen wilderness. The owners were anonymous, the boards were empty. The companies dissolved quietly between 1941 and 1944. That wasn't random, that was a timeline. Something began in 1919, and it ended, at least publicly, when the war started again. I flew into northern Montana under the pretense of a historical site survey. The address from the 1949 census, my grandmother's, wasn't listed on any GPS service. I rented a 4-wheel drive and traced old US geological maps until I found the route, a dirt access road that hadn't seen traffic in decades. The trees had grown thick, but the path was still there, just barely. I drove for nearly 40 minutes, losing cell signal within the first 10. At the top of a small ridge, the forest opened into a plateau, flat, treeless, and ringed by snow-stained hills. In the center stood the remnants of a chapel. It was smaller than the one in the photograph, but the design was unmistakable. The twin spires curled inward, not upward. No crosses, no bell, just stone walls, mostly intact, and a front door slightly ajar. I stepped inside, flashlight trembling in my grip. The air was dry, coated in decades of dust. The pews were gone, but metal brackets on the floor marked where they'd once stood. The walls were bare, except for a small panel of stained glass at the back. No religious iconography, just 3 interlocking rings. I moved slowly toward the rear chamber, half expecting to find nothing, but the floor gave a soft, metallic click beneath my boots. I knelt and cleared the dirt. A steel hatch padlocked shut. The lock was rusted but intact. I photographed everything, then hiked back to the car and drove until the signal returned. That night, I posted anonymously in a private historical restoration forum, asking for anyone with experience accessing buried industrial sites. Within hours, a user replied with coordinates. Was there in 1996, you're not the first. The profile was new, no history, no contact option. The coordinates led to another chapel ruin, this time in the Canadian Rockies, almost identical to the one I'd just visited. I didn't sleep. I started plotting every reference I'd found, every child's relocation site, every shell company property. There were 11 in total, all in remote, high-altitude regions, all within close proximity to abandoned pre-war mining colonies. And everyone showed traces of identical architecture, chapels without denomination, built to last, then left, to vanish. They weren't places of worship, They were holding sites designed to contain something or someone. 2 days after I uploaded the chapel photos to a secured drive, someone accessed the folder. I had encrypted it with triple-layer protocols and two-factor keys tied to burner numbers, but the log showed remote entry at 3:14 a.m. from an IP that traced back to a university server in Belgium, now defunct, flagged as archival only. The same morning, my email client locked me out, not with a password error, just a frozen screen and a message. Session terminated for policy reasons. I didn't try to get back in. Instead, I booked a last-minute flight to Calgary using cash and a fake name. I didn't tell anyone. I brought only a backup drive, 2 changes of clothes, and a burner phone I'd never used. At the airport, I noticed a man in a black windbreaker standing near the rental kiosks, and he wasn't doing anything wrong, just leaning, scrolling through his phone. But he appeared in 3 separate places before I even reached security. I rerouted through Edmonton, then drove through the night. No hotels, no calls, no receipts. By noon the next day, I reached the second chapel. This one partially collapsed, buried under snow and brush. No hatch this time, but the foundation had cracked, revealing a substructure. I climbed down into what looked like a root cellar, but the walls were concrete, not stone, and lined with fixtures I didn't recognize, vents, cables, small brackets that once held equipment. On the far wall was a strip of metal with numbers engraved into it. Coordinates. The site wasn't a chapel, it was a way station. I traced the numbers. They pointed to an unlisted lake deeper in the wilderness within another former land tract owned by the same shell company. That's when I made the decision. I was going to document everything and release it. Not as a story, not to the press. I didn't trust headlines. I'd build a dossier. Visuals, records, maps and witness accounts stitched into a timeline no one could ignore. I knew what that meant. I knew what it would cost. But it was already too late to walk away. That night I received a message on the burner. No number, just a file. It was a photo my grandmother, older than I'd ever seen her, seated at a table. On either side of her were 2 men in military uniforms with insignias I didn't recognize. All 3 were smiling. The message read, "She was never lost. She was chosen." I didn't move for hours after seeing that photo. My grandmother looked peaceful, composed, nothing like the woman who'd kept that part of her life locked away. I studied the uniforms worn by the men beside her. They weren't standard issues. The symbols on their collars were variations of the same 3 interlocking rings, stylized to look almost decorative. I ran a reverse image search, hoping it was fake, doctored, anything. But a match came back from a 1971 Swiss defense journal, Andiki, article about transnational cooperation in post-conflict scenarios. The caption beneath the photo read, "Confidential Liaison Summit, Site K4. I had no idea what Site K4 was, but I recognized the setting, the same chapel interior. The
Same stained glass. I started building a timeline.
If my grandmother had been part of the relocation and had later returned to one of the chapels in an official capacity, then the narrative I'd believed all my life, that she was a victim of war, was incomplete. Or false. That night, I opened the drive and recorded everything I'd uncovered. I narrated over maps, documents, and video footage of the chapel ruins. I included the registry files, the scanned symbols, the census photo, even the intercepted message. I encoded the drive, made 3 copies, and mailed each to trusted contacts under unrelated aliases. 1 to a private archivist in Maine, 1 to a law professor I'd met at a conference 5 years ago, 1 to a journalist who owed me a favor and knew how to disappear. Then I disappeared too, left my hotel before dawn, ditched the rental car in a commuter lot, and crossed into Alberta on foot through a forest reserve. I shaved my beard, changed my clothes, and rented a storage unit under a fake name. Inside, I set up a temporary workspace with an old laptop disconnected from any network. That's where I opened the final file I'd recovered, an audio recording embedded in the metadata of the chapel photo I received on the burner. It was short, just under 30 seconds. My grandmother's voice, unmistakable.
If you're hearing this, then you found the edge of it. We weren't taken, we were bred, not for betterment, for endurance. And now they want it hidden again. You decide what to do next. The file ended in silence. No static, no distortion. Just her voice, clear as I'd ever heard it.
And I knew then, without any doubt, that she hadn't escaped something. She'd outlived it. It's been 9 months since I mailed the dossiers. No one ever contacted me back. Not the archivist, not the professor, not the journalist, I assume. That means they're either compromised or silent for a reason. I haven't used my real name since I crossed into Alberta. I rent rooms in cash, move every 3 weeks, and avoid cameras. I carry 2 sets of ID and speak as little as possible. I tell myself this is safe, but it's something else too. Shame, maybe, or the quiet weight of knowing too much. The truth wasn't some grand revelation. It was a system. A slow, patient mechanism built not to harm directly, but to sculpt, to filter. From 1915 through the mid-century, children weren't lost. They were rerouted, chosen not for brilliance, but for pliability. Isolated, observed and used to test generational compatibility, eugenics without the banners. The survivors weren't left behind by history, they were history's experiment, and some of them, like my grandmother, were brought back in. I've spent countless nights replaying her voice from that message. I wonder how long she knew, whether she believed in it, resisted it, or simply learned to endure it in silence. I've started documenting again, quietly. Not for exposure, not anymore, just for clarity, for memory. I've mapped every confirmed chapel site and matched them to local census voids, land transfer anomalies, and private medical clinics that operated without licensure during the 1950s. The pattern is too clean to ignore. Remote regions, minimal, oversight, and then sudden bursts of adoption records with no birth certificates. These people live among us now, descendants of that plan, not superhuman, not sinister, just born from a process that was never meant to be known. Some of them must feel it the way I always did, a sense that something's off, that their lineage doesn't match the stories they were told. Maybe this story reaches them, maybe not. I don't plan to keep running. I'll vanish eventually by choice or force. But this record will remain. The final entry in a story that never belonged in textbooks. A quiet history carved in silence, survival, and forgotten names. My name no longer matters, but hers does. Adelina Mersch. She was never just a victim, she was the proof. And now, so am I. I was 6 years old when the dream started, lucid, vivid, and exactly synchronized with two other kids I'd never met. It was summer in the suburbs of Osaka in 1977. My parents were part of the post-war generation that saw conformity as survival. My father worked late shifts at a parts factory. My mother kept the home quiet and spotless. I was the quiet type, good at school, terrible at making friends. That's probably why I was chosen. No one noticed when the van picked me up after school 3 times a week. It looked like a normal tutoring service, even had a cartoon mascot painted on the side. But instead of books or homework, we were taken to an underground wing of the Kita Research Hospital. They called it a sleep lab. The walls were padded not for safety, but to keep the sound out or in. The air always smelled faintly of antiseptic and old electronics. We wore identical grey pyjamas and were given milk with a strange taste before being ushered into dim sleeping chambers. At the time, it felt like a strange summer camp. We played memory games on flickering monitors, answered odd questions about dreams, and were praised when we saw the same things. The doctors wore face masks and never smiled. They monitored our REM cycles through thick glass, scribbling notes even while we slept. I didn't understand what they were looking for. None of us did. But I started recognizing the other 2 kids. 1 girl, 1 boy. We shared the same dreamscapes. Red bridges over endless rivers. A classroom where time moved backward. We began to speak inside the dreams, clearly, fluently, though in waking life we never met. Our parents weren't told anything beyond vague reassurances about sleep therapy and cognitive enrichment. Then one day, the van stopped coming. I woke up at home, no more sessions, and no one talked about it again. My memories faded like dreams do, but in 2025 I saw her face on the news, the girl from my dreams. Same as she was back then, except now she was being pulled from a coma. 48 years of unbroken sleep, and I felt it again, that strange pull in the back of my mind, like someone knocking not on a door but from inside a shared dream that never really ended. It started with a headline buried halfway down a news site. Coma patient awakens after 48 years. It would have been easy to scroll past if not for the photo. Her face was older, sure, but unmistakable. Same wide-set eyes, same birthmark near her temple. I hadn't seen her since 1977, but something deeper than memory recognized her instantly. I clicked the article. The name listed wasn't the one I remembered, but her hospital ID, K127, matched what the doctors used to call her. The story was light on detail. She'd been transferred to a private care facility in Tokyo 2 decades ago, listed as non-responsive. No family interviews, no updates. But a curious line stood out. Recent EEG data shows anomalies previously undocumented in chronic coma cases. That night, I pulled out my old laptop, the one I kept offline, and started digging. At first, the trail was cold. K127 returned nothing to search engines, but a defunct forum for sleep disorder research had a thread from 2009 titled Project UM. Weaponized lucidity. It sounded like fiction until I recognized some of the terminology. REM entertainment, audio-linguistic feedback, phase alignment. All terms the researchers had used when they thought we weren't listening. A user named Telex77 posted a link to a Japanese FTP server, now dead, but I found cached fragments through an archived mirror. One clip, buried in a zip file labeled K77 internal, showed grainy security footage. Date stamp, July 1979. The camera looked down on a hospital corridor. A gurney passed by, surrounded by men in unmarked uniforms. On it lay a small boy with electrodes on his temples. I paused the footage. It was me, or someone who looked exactly like I did back
Then
A second clip showed a windowless room. Two children seated on opposite ends, motionless. No sound, no blinking. Their brain activity scrolled along the bottom in real time, identical patterns, pulsing like mirrored waves. I downloaded everything and disconnected from the network. My hands were shaking. It wasn't just her who had been asleep. There were more of us, and someone had been watching the whole time. The dreams weren't over, they'd just gone underground. Over the next week I combed through every digital scrap I could find, old academic journals, scanned defense white papers, and, quietly, erased patent filings from the late 1970s. The name Yuma appeared only once, in a redacted line of a declassified Ministry of Health document, subject transfer to Hume Division, authorized under National Security Clause 6B. No further context, but cross-referencing budget allocations from the same year pointed to a massive uptick in funding for civilian neurocognitive welfare, a known cover term for black budget behavioral programs. I began mapping the dates to known institutions. In every case, the pattern was the same. State-run schools partnered with adjacent clinics, then both quietly shuttered within 2 years. The most damning piece came from a leaked transcript dated November 1980. It detailed a closed-door session between Japanese intelligence officers and American consultants. One section stood out, subjects exhibiting cross-phase persistence beyond lab boundaries. Dream state cooperation indicates pre-verbal ideation exchange. The phrase disturbed me. It suggested not only conscious awareness within dreams, but structured interaction, strategy, communication, planning. Like the children weren't just dreaming, but collaborating, coordinated sleepers, lucid operatives. The idea felt absurd, until I reviewed EEG overlays from the footage I'd saved. 3 children, including myself, showed identical REM spikes within the same 5-second interval, measured in real time across different rooms. That shouldn't be possible. I dug into similar programs abroad. The US had MK Delta and Stargate. The Soviets ran the Red Sleep Initiative, but Hume was different. It wasn't about interrogation or telepathy, it was about containment. Every reference to the project ended in the same phrase, state-induced, honoric stabilization. A dream so stable it became a second reality, one that could hold its inhabitants indefinitely. That was the real purpose of Yume. Not weaponizing lucid dreamers, but locking them in. Creating a sealed environment where memory, time, and identity could be rewritten. But something went wrong. And now, in 2025, the seals were breaking. The dreamers were waking up, and whatever war they fought in that place, they hadn't finished it. It was located in the hills outside Kyoto, disguised as a defunct pediatric center. The building hadn't been demolished, just sealed, and quietly erased from local records. but I remembered the drive, the bend in the road just before the gate, and the narrow gravel path behind the main structure. I arrived just after sunrise, dressed like a surveyor, with a clipboard and an old satchel. The property was unguarded, its perimeter fence broken in several places. Vines had overtaken the signage. No one had been here in decades. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and disinfectant that had outlived its purpose. Floor tiles were cracked, paint peeled in long strips from the ceiling, but the layout came back to me instantly. I didn't need a map. My feet moved from memory. The hallway with the cartoon murals. The door marked Sleep Wing 3. The room from the dream was at the end of that corridor. When I stepped inside, something stopped me cold. The cot was still there. So was the observation mirror. But what unnerved me wasn't the decay. It was the fact that someone had been here recently. On the mattress lay a folded hospital gown pressed flat. Beside it, an old ECG printout dated last month. The ink was fresh. I followed the power conduit running along the baseboard. It led to a box hidden behind a false panel in the wall. Inside was a powered-down data logger, the kind used to capture neural telemetry in real time. I connected it to my offline laptop and waited. The file tree was sparse, but one video stood out. It showed a child, around 7 years old, curled on the same cot, electrodes placed precisely where mine had once been. The date stamp read April 2025, less than 3 weeks ago. In the corner of the frame stood a man in a lab coat, partially
obscured. When he turned slightly, I paused the video. I recognized him. Same sharp features, just older. He'd been one of the researchers back then. I didn't know his name, but I remembered his voice from the dream.
He was still conducting sessions, still recording. Yume hadn't ended. It had just gone deeper underground. I thought carefully before releasing the files. The footage from the Kyoto facility, the fresh printouts, the timestamp, it was evidence, not speculation, but I didn't trust cloud services or whistleblower platforms. I used an isolated laptop I kept offline and uploaded everything through a buried node on an encrypted archive I'd once used while subcontracting for a private intelligence firm. The server was secure, rarely active, and had no indexing. I uploaded the video, wiped the XIF data, then shut the machine down. Less than 3 hours later, my phone rang. The screen was blank. No number, no origin. I let it ring twice before answering without speaking. A male voice came through, low and steady. You were part of Phase 1. You were never meant to. Wake up. Then silence. No follow-up, no demands, just a reminder that someone was watching. That night, my laptop refused to start. It didn't crash, it stalled. When I powered it on, it froze at the manufacturer's logo. I tried booting from a flash drive. Nothing. I opened the machine, replaced the drive, and ran a diagnostic from cold hardware. The logs showed a forced remote access sequence routed through an IP block tied to a Japanese telecom satellite, one not used for commercial traffic. Someone had quietly reached into a disconnected device. That scared me more than the call. I packed it immediately. Burner phone, physical maps, no digital trail. I changed hotels every night, avoided major cities, paid in cash. Still they followed. I started seeing the same car within hours of checking in. A silver sedan with a dent in the rear panel and an idle driver pretending not to watch. The deeper
I ran, the more the dreams returned. Symbols began to follow me into waking life. They'd appear on signs, receipts, cracks in windows, and voices, just a phrase or two, echoing as I woke.
Sometimes in my own handwriting I'd find notes I didn't remember writing. One said, Nagano, Y Sato, subject 3 active. I cross-referenced it with an anonymous journal article published by a neuroimaging lab outside Nagano, one of the case. Studies described an unnamed participant exhibiting synchronized dream state signals matching historic MK class EEG patterns. No names were given, but I knew it was him, Yuji Sato. He'd been the 3rd child in our test group. Officially, he'd
Never woken up.
but the article confirmed his brainwave patterns had changed sharply and recently. I called the clinic using a vague cover story about academic research. When I asked if I could speak to one of their long-term neurological subjects, the woman hesitated before transferring me. A man picked up, spoke only one sentence, and hung up. You're not too late, but we have to meet in the dream. It's the only place they don't control. Yet. I didn't sleep for nearly 40 hours, afraid of what would be waiting, but exhaustion always wins. When I finally drifted off, the transition was seamless. I opened my eyes to the same corridor, from our shared childhood dreams, long, white and humming with low electrical current. They were already there, standing beneath the flickering ceiling lights. Sato looked different now, older, leaner, alert. But it was him. The girl, Naomi, hadn't aged at all. She appeared exactly as I remembered from 1977, which made no sense. We didn't speak at first. We didn't have to. The dream carried meaning without words. Emotions passed between us like signals, recognition, fear, urgency. Then Sato reached out and touched the wall and everything shifted. We were inside a different space now, some kind of observation dome, floating in blackness. Around us, fragments of past dreams played on suspended panes of light, scenes we remembered and some we didn't. They trained us here, Naomi said quietly. Not just to dream, but to fight. There was something on the other side. I nodded. It wasn't a metaphor. We'd been sent into the dream state to confront something, an intelligence, a presence not made by any nation, but still shaped like war. The war didn't end, Sato said. They just silenced the ones who could speak about it. He turned one of the panes toward me, revealing a memory I didn't know I had. A lab, deep underground, monitors showing real-time REM activity across multiple subjects. All children, all linked. They were still running the program, and worse, they were expanding it. Outside the dream, I jolted awake, breathless. I'd scrawled something on the notepad by my bed in my sleep. Just one line. Phase 2 begins in 14 days. I knew then we were out of time. I gathered everything I had, footage, EEG overlays, medical papers, translated transcripts, and compressed them into a single archive. Then I sent it to every investigative journalist I trusted, which wasn't many. By midnight, my email was locked, my cloud access revoked, and my personal bank accounts frozen. The suppression had begun. But something changed after that dream. the real world started to blur. I saw strangers staring too long on crowded trains, streetlights flickering in perfect rhythm with my heartbeat. The dream wasn't staying in sleep anymore, it was bleeding through. And so were we. It's been 6 weeks since I sent the archive. 2 journalists tried to publish it. One was discredited overnight, accused of academic fraud based on doctored articles that appeared out of nowhere. The other disappeared the day before her piece was scheduled to run. Her apartment was found locked from the inside. No sign of struggle. No sign of her. I've since stopped trying to push the story forward. It's not fear exactly, it's futility. Every time I make a move, they're already 3 steps ahead. But I'm not alone anymore. Naomi woke up fully last month, and she remembers everything. Sato hasn't been seen since the last dream, but I know he's still connected. Occasionally, I catch fragments of him, flashes of thought or memory, when I drift into sleep. We don't control it the way we used to. The shared space comes when it wants. And lately, it's been different. Bigger. Less contained. I've seen images from places I've never been. Military installations, underground bunkers, classrooms with children staring into light arrays. Their eyes don't blink. Their dreams aren't theirs. The program didn't stop in 1977. It evolved. The ones in charge learned to hide it better. Fewer chemicals. More tech. I suspect some of the new subjects never even sleep. Their consciousness is routed directly through artificial loops, always on, always dreaming, but never in control. We were the prototype. They're the final version. I don't know how long I have left in the waking world. Every night, the pull gets stronger. My body sleeps longer than it should. My memories blur around the edges. Sometimes I speak in the language from the dreams, words I was never taught, but somehow understand. I've begun writing it all down by hand. No devices, no networks, just ink and paper. If you're reading this, it means something slipped through, a crack in the wall, maybe small but real. There won't be a moment of revelation, no big unveiling. It won't be televised or leaked. It'll happen slowly, in places most people never notice. Sleep labs, classrooms, waiting rooms. And then one day, we'll all wake up to find we were never really awake at all. The ice didn't break under our feet. It gave way like it had been waiting. In the winter of 1983, I was stationed as a logistics officer at McMurdo Station, Antarctica. Officially, we were there to oversee weather satellite calibrations and supply routes for the summer research season. Unofficially, we were part of a NATO-aligned joint intelligence project code-named Argon Shield, tasked with recovering classified artifacts from beneath the ice shelf. We weren't told much more than that. My role was strictly logistical. I tracked inventory manifests, fuel reserves and flight paths. It was all routine until a British geologist named Dr. Whitaker requested a shipment be diverted 280 kilometres inland to an area not marked on any of our operational maps. I flagged it at first. The location wasn't part of any scheduled expedition, and the request was marked with a clearance level I hadn't seen before. But when I questioned it, I was told, very directly, that I didn't need to understand every part of the mission to perform my role. The cargo wasn't unusual. 2 prefabricated shelters, food rations, excavation tools, and several crates labelled archival containment. Nothing screamed danger, nothing felt covert. But there was something in the air that week, a kind of quiet tension that reminded me of the weeks leading up to a deployment in Bosnia. Radios started going silent more often. Helicopter schedules became erratic. Some of the newer personnel stopped socializing entirely. Then one morning, a Russian IL-76 landed unannounced. No flags, no insignia. They offloaded 3 crates and didn't file a manifest. I saw one of them open by accident, just for a second. Inside were what looked like lead-lined cases and an old film projector. Not digital, not a military issue. My supervisor told me to forget what I saw and assigned me night watch rotations for the next 2 weeks, a punishment in all but name. I didn't ask questions after that, but things kept getting stranger. One night during a low-visibility storm, we lost contact with the inland team. They were equipped with redundant comms. All of them went dark at once. 4 hours later, the mainframe auto-logged a transmission ping, just coordinates, no message, no call sign. When we triangulated the source, it wasn't coming from their last known position. It was coming from inside a glacial fissure recorded in 1947 and since marked inaccessible due to collapse. That was the first time I felt it in my gut. Something wasn't just wrong, something had been hidden. And whatever they'd found, it was older than any of us expected. The coordinates led to a sector flagged in our archives as a post-war survey gap, a bureaucratic way of saying no one had set foot there since 1947. I didn't think much of it until I pulled up the old mission logs from that year. The files were supposed to be declassified, routine joint operations between US and UK forces doing seismic mapping post-Operation High Jump. But the documents had been scanned from carbon copies and half the names were redacted. One line stood out. Site Theta, initial breach successful. Artifacts consistent with hypothesized pre-Ice Age strata. Civilian ethnologists en route. Ethnologists in Antarctica in 1947. That made no sense. I ran a quiet back-channel query through our NATO Field Archive portal. Instead of a denial, I received a 404 redirect to an isolated server tagged with a UQSA 43 security protocol. I'd never seen that tag before. It dated to before the formation of NATO. The files were mostly image captures, photographs of something, half buried in ice, angular stonework, and the charred remains of what looked unmistakably like human skeletal structures. But they were wrong. Too tall, limb ratios distorted, skulls elongated. Some showed trace metal implants fused to the bone, not unlike cranial ports used in early EEG experiments. There were handwritten annotations in the margins in 3 different styles. One said, confirmed, non-alien origin, Homo sapiens, derivation. Another read, radiocarbon dating inconclusive, sample degraded, estimated at 12,000 old YBP. I remember staring at that number for a long time. 12,000 years. That would place them before the Younger Dryas, before organized agriculture, before cities. And yet someone had built structures out of shaped stone and alloys that didn't show signs of corrosion. I kept digging. A German transcript buried in the same directory described an Unterirdisch Zuflucht, an underground refuge, discovered during a clandestine U-boat mission in late 1944. The officer's report claimed they'd encountered geometric tunnels unfit for human construction but containing evidence of language and power systems. No follow-up. No recovery logs. Just silence. I backed out and checked access logs. I wasn't alone. Someone else had pinged these documents 6 hours before I had. An IP routed through Brussels. NATO command. My workstation froze twice that night. No errors. Just blank screen and restart. It wasn't until the next day that someone left a note in my private locker. No name, just a half-folded printout. A single line typed across the top in courier font. They never left. They adapted. And they remember. It took me another 6 days to make sense of the note. They remember. That line kept echoing, even during routine tasks. I started looking into post-war geological anomalies, but from a different angle, civilian research that was later absorbed by military institutions. One name came up repeatedly in buried bibliographies: Dr. Thomas Everling, a geochronologist whose early work on subglacial formations was cited and then abruptly erased from academic references after 1952. His last published paper, preserved only through a university archive in Zurich, referenced evidence of anthropogenic architecture in zones predating the Laurentide collapse. That language was careful. Too careful. I tracked down a surviving audio interview conducted in 1961, never broadcast, but logged in a now-defunct research initiative called Project Isotope. The audio was grainy, but his words were clear. The ice covers memory. Beneath it lie the fingerprints of a civilization that ended itself in fire and then fled below, not upward. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. The rest of the interview had been redacted by hand, entire segments cut with a razor blade. It felt less like censorship and more like a message, a ritual dissection. Around the same time, I received an internal memo about atmospheric interference in Sector 4L, the same coordinates from 1947. The interference had been flagged by orbital reconnaissance satellites, specifically within the infrared spectrum. Bursts of symmetrical heat, signatures appearing and vanishing at intervals too regular to be natural. The data resembled power cycling, energy discharging from something not mechanical but biological. That's when it clicked. The structures weren't just ruins, they were active, not in use but alive in some residual way. The ruins weren't abandoned, they were dormant. I cross-referenced the data with deep Earth neutrino scans and found something else, vague but consistent waveforms emerging from beneath the ice shelf, mimicking tectonic tremors, but too clean, too rhythmic. Someone was masking activity as a natural disaster. I brought this to Captain Moraine, our liaison to the intelligence unit. He read the packet slowly, closed the folder, and asked if I had spoken to anyone else. I told him no. He looked relieved. Then he gave me one piece of advice I've never forgotten. Don't chase it to the bottom, that's where it waits. It's not ancient, it's patient. I think that was the first time I truly understood. This wasn't a buried civilization. It was a buried memory, still awake, still shaping the world from underneath it. The flight inland was listed as a weather monitoring mission, but everyone on board knew better. We flew low in a modified LC-130 rigged with extra shielding and communications blackout protocols. The crew didn't speak much. Our destination wasn't on any current map, but the coordinates matched what the 1947 logs had called Site Theta. From above it looked like nothing, a flat, frozen plateau surrounded by pressure ridges. But once we landed, the ice felt wrong beneath our boots. Not soft, but unstable, like it had been disturbed from below. There was already a structure in place when we arrived, half buried under a camouflage tarp that didn't match any known military
standard.
I recognized it instantly from the satellite briefs, a modular shelter prefabricated for long-duration deployment, outfitted with independent power and climate control. Someone had been here recently. Inside, the power was still running. The lights flickered, not from age, but from voltage irregularities. Something was drawing more than the system was rated to handle. In the back room, we found racks of analog equipment, mostly film projectors and magnetic tape readers. None of it connected to satellite uplink, all of it offline. There were shelves of documents in English, French, and Cyrillic, labels marked, with dates ranging from 1947 to 1979. I opened a case labeled Reliquary Deep Access. Inside were photographs, the kind developed in darkrooms, not labs. They showed the same structures seen in the original dig logs, archways, stepped corridors, and what looked like stone reliefs, but the carvings were unmistakably human. Stylized, yes. Primitive, maybe. But the facial structure, the hand proportions, the way they clustered in concentric spirals, it wasn't alien. It was ancestral. The camera gear was outdated but usable. I powered one of the projectors and fed the reel through. It showed a descending expedition, possibly French or Belgian, by the voiceovers, following a narrow shaft into a subglacial cavern. As the footage flickered, I saw something that made my breath stop. There were lights, not artificial, but embedded into the stone. They pulsed with a low orange glow like bioluminescence. One of the researchers reached out to touch the surface, and the film cut. No ending, no follow-up, just a sharp splice and silence. We searched the rest of the shelter and found a single cot unmade and a small journal written in looping Cyrillic. I don't read Russian, but one phrase has been underlined in English. Not a ruin, a refuge, and it's still sealed. That night, we slept in shifts. The wind outside never stopped, but every so often it would pause just long enough for
us to hear something beneath it. Not voices, not machines, just the unmistakable sound of moving stone.
We were scheduled for extraction at 0700, but the pilot never made contact. Comms were live, signal strength steady, but no response. We waited 6 hours before taking the backup route south along the ridge, hauling our equipment by snowcrawler. It wasn't a retreat, it was a shift in trajectory, quiet and deliberate. The shelter had raised more questions than answers, and command wasn't going to authorize further excavation without confirmation. That's when I made the decision to breach the ice. The fissure from the 1947 map was real, partially collapsed, but still accessible. The thermal scans showed a negative heat anomaly below it, an empty pocket colder than the surrounding ice. That defied physics. We rigged a micro-bore sonar unit and drilled descent support. 40 minutes in, the probe slipped into open air. I'll never forget the sound it made, like it was falling forever, and then it wasn't. The echo came back dense, layered and wrong. Not a cave, not a tunnel, a chamber, man-made. I sent a full packet to command, flagged urgent. I got a response within the hour, not authorization, a lockout. My credentials were suspended, my access to the archive was revoked, my outgoing channels are restricted. A new team arrived at our temporary outpost less than a day later. civilian, clothes, military posture. One of them carried a sealed case with a biometric lock. I wasn't invited to the briefing. Instead, I was handed a transfer notice and told I was being reassigned to logistics at Thule Air Base in Greenland. No explanation, no appeal. I asked what would happen to the site. No one answered. That night, I pulled the local satellite data from our autonomous drone and reprocessed it through an off-grid terminal I'd been building for months. The deep scan showed something unmistakable: angular formations aligned to magnetic north, buried in a lattice beneath the fissure. Buildings, not scattered ruins. A layout, a grid. I sent the data to two contacts, one at a civilian climate agency, the other a former intelligence analyst turned private contractor. Both went dark within 48 hours, phones disconnected, emails bouncing. I got a text from an unknown number. Don't send again, they're watching endpoints. My cabin was searched the next morning. Nothing taken. Nothing said. Just the impression that someone had been in a place they shouldn't have found. That's when I started deleting my identity, piece by piece. I knew what came next. I'd seen it before in other theaters. Surveillance escalates, patterns attract, disappearances happen off paper. I wasn't going to vanish quietly. I'd seen too much. And more importantly, I'd finally understood what we were standing on. Not a continent, a lid. 3 weeks after my forced reassignment, I was living under a new name in Reykjavik, using cash and rotating short-term rentals. I kept off networks, but I wasn't hiding. I was waiting. One night, just past midnight, I received a physical envelope slipped under my door. No return address. Inside was a single Polaroid and a piece of paper with coordinates written in pencil. The photo showed what looked like a conference room, wood-panelled walls, men in suits, and on the screen behind them a grainy aerial image of Antarctica. Someone had circled the image in red. I knew that room. It was in Brussels, NATO headquarters. I recognized the insignia above the projector screen. This wasn't just a scientific anomaly anymore, it was policy. I followed the coordinates cautiously. They led to a coastal archive in Western Iceland, supposedly decommissioned. Inside, past rusted locks and broken hinges, I found a series of file cabinets untouched by mold or moisture. They hadn't just been stored, they'd been preserved, intentionally, like someone was waiting for the right eyes to find them. I opened the top drawer and found documents labelled with a name I hadn't heard since McMurdo, Project Nereus. Inside were logs from the 1947 expedition, including handwritten transcripts translated from German, describing a vault below the glacier, engineered by survivors of the surface war. It was the first time I saw that phrase in writing. Surface war. The logs described not a battle between nations, but a cataclysm between generations. The idea was almost too much to process. A war fought over 12,000 years ago, ending in total nuclear devastation, forcing the remnants of a human civilization to flee underground. They weren't aliens, they were us. An older version, technologically advanced, biologically compatible, and strategically patient. The evidence had been known for decades, even studied. The NATO documents included psychological profiles, language, matrices, even contact protocols. One file listed contemporary geopolitical events alongside notes on suggested influence vectors. It wasn't an observation, it was participation. These descendants, whoever they were, had shaped policy, redirected agendas, even manipulated global tensions to preserve their secrecy. And the most staggering part was this: none of it was speculative. There were signatures, meeting logs, official stamps. It was real. That night, as I loaded the documents into a weatherproof bag, I realized I was already too late. I stepped outside to find my rental car's tires slashed, and across the driver's side door, drawn in the condensation, was a single symbol, a spiral, the same design etched into the walls beneath the ice. They knew, they'd always known we hadn't discovered them in 1947, we'd been allowed to find them, because the moment they wanted to disappear again, we'd never be able to follow. I've spent the last 11 years off-grid moving between continents, always close to the cold, always listening. I've never stayed longer than 6 months in one place. I don't use banks, I don't use phones, and I never go near airports. Some would call it paranoia, but paranoia implies a lack
Of evidence, I have plenty. Enough to know the vault beneath Antarctica wasn't an isolated site.
It was one of many, part of a global infrastructure buried beneath glacial shelves, desert plateaus, oceanic trenches. I've seen references to others, one beneath the Tibetan plateau, another buried inside the caldera wall of an extinct volcano in the southern Andes, each location tied to the same indicators: heat anomalies without thermal cause, rhythmic EM pulses disguised as tectonic interference, and that same spiral pattern, always in stone, always at an angle, just slightly off.
From human symmetry, they're not hiding anymore.
They're adjusting, integrating. The signals have changed, less like pulses, more like code. They don't speak our language, not exactly, but they understand how to shape perception. I've watched narratives shift online, real-time corrections, to information leaks, accounts wiped before they're read. I've tracked embedded phrases in international policy drafts that mirror symbols found in the lower vault reliefs. None of it is accidental. I've come to believe we're not just being influenced, we're being steered, quietly, across generations, towards something we were never meant to question. Not an invasion, an inheritance. And the ones shaping it believe it's theirs to reclaim. I've kept records, hidden them in places only people like me know how to find. Not to expose them, I know better than that now, but to give someone else a starting point. Maybe a warning, maybe a second chance. The truth is, I don't
Sleep much anymore. I don't dream.
But when I do, it's always the same image. A smooth obsidian chamber under the ice, spiraling downward forever. And in the center, not a throne, not a machine, but a mirror. Cracked, waiting. I no longer believe we uncovered a secret in Antarctica.
I believe we were reminded of one we chose to forget. And somewhere deep below they're still listening. Because history, like ice, doesn't disappear. It buries, it waits, and then one day, it melts.
If sunlight can carry information, what's been riding on its back all these centuries? That's the question I can't unhear. Not since the Mali dig. Before that, things were quieter. I taught environmental archaeology at a mid-tier university, spent summers consulting on erosion patterns for NGOs, and had a drawer full of sunblock receipts to prove it. We weren't chasing legends, we were measuring stone degradation near the Bandiagara escarpment, trying to date some obscure pre-Islamic settlements that barely made it into the oral histories. It was slow, dusty work. Then, on a blistering afternoon in late March, we found the first disc. Flat, smooth, hand-sized. At first glance it looked like obsidian, but it didn't shatter when dropped, didn't scratch. And when our assistant Temi left it under direct sunlight, it pulsed, dimly, rhythmically, as if responding. No one believed it was real at first. We joked it was quartz reacting to heat, till our geophysicist ran a basic spectrometry test and muttered, "This thing's photoreactive." But the spectrum is structured. Structured. That word changed everything. We found 5 more over the next week, each buried under layers of ancient ash and sediment, spaced with impossible regularity. No inscriptions, no cultural motifs, just perfectly shaped discs, all made from a material none of us could identify. They didn't store heat, but they emitted measurable EM fields when exposed to direct sunlight. Not strong, but patterned. I remember lying in my tent one night, re-watching the sensor data and thinking, this doesn't feel archaeological, it feels deliberate. That's when the emails started. Unsolicited requests from labs I hadn't contacted, offering to assist in analysis or to house the artifacts securely. Some of them came from universities I respected, others were from shell institutions that didn't seem to exist. Last year, Temi said I was being paranoid, but she hadn't seen how fast the funding came through when I casually mentioned the discs to a friend at the National Research Foundation. Within 72 hours, a private courier arrived with a grant proposal, unsigned. It was generous, too generous. That night I opened one of the discs under a UV lamp out of sheer impulse. For a second, a holographic glyph flickered across its surface. It looked like a waveform. Then it vanished. That was the last night I slept without dreams. The morning after the glyph appeared, I tried to replicate the effect, but nothing happened. No flicker, no pulse, just a silent, inert disc reflecting the shape of my own uncertainty. Still, I couldn't shake what I'd seen. I sent high-resolution photos and spectral readouts to a friend in Zurich, a physicist who dabbled in solar radiation encoding. I left out where the discs were found, just said they were part of a solar energy study. He wrote back the same day. This isn't energy storage. It's data, encrypted, possibly modular. That word, modular, kept me up that night. If the discs were components of something larger, how many were missing? Or worse, already found? Temi and I combed through the satellite imagery of the dig site, cross-referencing with old excavation logs looking for patterns. That's when we noticed the layout. The discs hadn't been buried randomly. They formed a spiral, subtle, wide, almost a quarter-kilometre in diameter, if we traced the spacing outward. A spiral not aligned with magnetic north, but with solar declination from roughly 12,000 years ago. The implications were too strange to say out loud, so we didn't. We just stared at the map until the screen dimmed. I spent that evening parsing the EM readings from the discs. One of them emitted a faint pulse every 6 minutes. It wasn't regular like a heartbeat. It was timed, precise, like a looped packet. I built a spectrogram model and layered the output over a digital sine wave, filtering for anomalies. Buried in the interference was a low-band signal repeating 3 alphanumeric symbols in a language I couldn't identify. I posted the waveform anonymously to a physics forum I trusted. Within hours, the thread was locked, archived, and scrubbed from search. When I asked the moderator why, they messaged me privately. That frequency is under federal monitoring. Take it down." I hadn't even said what it was. That night I returned to the site alone and placed one of the discs in the center of the spiral. Nothing happened at first, but when I activated my shortwave scanner, the static cleared for just a second, and a fragment of sound broke through. A voice. Not human, not robotic, just wrong. It said something I didn't understand, then cut to silence. I sat there, in the dark, the scanner hissing beside me, and realized this wasn't archaeology anymore. We'd tripped something, activated something, and someone else already knew. I spent the next week in a state of controlled obsession. Every moment not spent on official work was dedicated to the discs. I stopped sleeping through the night, waking every few hours to check equipment logs and refresh forums under different aliases. One post, a deep thread on pre-flood civilizations, mentioned solar vector memory stones discovered in Algeria during a covert French expedition in the 1950s. Supposedly, they vanished before cataloguing, with the lead archaeologist institutionalized 6 months later. No official record of that mission exists, but I found a single blurry photo of a disc-shaped object resting on a stone slab with what looked like embedded solar glyphs. The resemblance was undeniable. At the same time, a pattern was forming in the signal output. The glyph that flickered that first night had reappeared, this time under filtered infrared light, not UV. We were dealing with layered encoding. The disk held multiple signatures, each responsive to specific frequencies of light. It wasn't just encrypted, it was designed to be accessed sequentially like chapters in a book, each one requiring a different wavelength to reveal. When I shared this with Temi, she didn't speak for a long time. Then she pulled up an obscure paper by a Cameroonian historian outlining oral myths of a stone sun choir that once sang to the skies during the longest day. The myth described a structure of stone records that stored knowledge from the before times, buried when the last sky fire cleansed the world. According to the storyteller, it happened during the time when the oceans left and returned. I stared at that phrase for a long time. It felt absurd until I cross-referenced it with geologic data. The last abrupt sea level change, roughly 12,000 years ago, it matched the solar alignment of the spiral. Everything pointed to an event, a reset, not metaphorical, actual. And buried in the discs was something preserved through it. But why discs? Why here? Why now? I ran a waveform correlation using historical sunspot cycles and realized something that chilled me. The EM pulse from the discs wasn't constant. It was syncing with the solar cycle's shift toward a maximum, projected to peak in under 3 years. And the more I looked, the more I saw evidence that someone else knew this too. A server ping tracing back to a defense contractor in the archive. US had quietly accessed our public research portal. The file they downloaded was labeled SP6 disk log. We hadn't posted that file, it was local only. Temi had a contact in Bamako, an archivist named Idrissa, who specialized in colonial-era cartography. He met us late one evening in a shuttered government records building, the kind with warped floorboards and fans that never worked. He didn't ask questions, just led us through a series of locked cabinets and rolled out a series of maps dated between 1887 and 1931. One of them stopped me cold. Near the edge of the Dogon Plateau, past any current excavation sites, was a red-inked mark labelled in French, Site Interdite, 1910. No explanation, just that warning. Idrissa said the archive held a brief field report written in brittle colonial French. The translation was loose, but the core was unmistakable. Soldiers had reported a cave structure with symmetrical stone objects embedded in walls and a heatless blue light that caused loss of time and physical confusion. The report was terminated 2 pages in. No follow-up, no photographs, no return expedition. Temi and I left before sunrise and drove 5 hours to the plateau. We found the cave near the cliff's edge, half collapsed and hidden behind a natural overhang. The air changed when we stepped inside, cooler, charged, the way metal smells during a lightning storm. Carvings lined the interior, shallow grooves in geometric spirals almost identical to the disc engravings. And at the back of the chamber was a stone pedestal, scorched black at the top, as if something had once burned cold. We placed one of the discs onto the pedestal. It fit perfectly. The moment it made contact, the glyph reappeared, not faint, but sharp, floating 6 inches above the disc's surface. A low hum began to vibrate through the stone, and then the cave itself changed. Lines that had looked like random scratches on the walls began to pulse, revealing a massive circular design spanning the chamber, a solar calendar carved into the rock itself. 12 divisions, 12 symbols, and at the center a spiral like the one at our dig site. The last date marked on the calendar was 3 years from now. Nothing after, no continuation. Temi looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Fear, not of danger, but of confirmation. This wasn't speculation anymore. It wasn't a theory. It was a countdown. And we had just activated the clock. By the time we returned to the main camp, our tents had been ransacked. Nothing taken, nothing broken, but every zipper unzipped. Every notebook moved just slightly. Our satellite router had been disabled. Cleanly, no damage, just a single cable detached and placed neatly on top of the closed laptop. I didn't say anything to the team. Most of them weren't involved, beyond logistics, and would only panic. But Temi and I stopped pretending we weren't being watched. That night, she wiped her phone, pulled the battery, and started using an old digital voice recorder for notes. I did the same. We buried the discs in separate locations, each marked only in our memory. 2 days later, we received a formal invitation to present our findings at a scientific conference in Geneva, sponsored by an energy think tank neither of us had heard of. The message used our full names, mentioned specific parts of the site we hadn't published, and offered to provide full security support for travel. I didn't respond. Temi traced the sender's IP, routed through 4 proxy layers originating from a data center in Luxembourg known for government contracts. We went dark after that. No emails, no uploads. We printed our data, encrypted it twice, and mailed copies to trusted colleagues with instructions to open them only if we went silent. Still the pressure mounted. We noticed drones, small, silent, hovering just long enough to be noticed before disappearing behind the cliffs. One of our local guides quit abruptly, refusing to explain. Another simply vanished, his tent abandoned, shoes still beside the cot. Then came the noise, a low-frequency hum at night, almost imperceptible, but enough to wake us both. It matched the resonance from the cave, and it wasn't constant. It came in waves, 30 minutes on, an hour off. We checked the EM field data. It was being amplified, somehow, likely rebroadcast from a higher altitude, which meant someone had not only intercepted the disk signals, but was now using them. For what, we didn't know. But the spiral calendar's final date, December 27th, 3 years from now, suddenly felt less theoretical. That was when Temi asked me a question I hadn't allowed myself to consider. Do we try to warn people? My instinct was yes. But who, exactly? And more importantly, would anyone let us? We made the decision the following morning. Temi began compiling a public release. Nothing dramatic, just raw data, spectral analysis, annotated photographs, and a full report on the spiral calendar and its correlation with solar maximum cycles. We intended to leak it through academic channels, open source platforms, and a handful of trusted science journalists. Our hope was that the evidence would speak louder than speculation. We never got the chance. That night, our external hard drives were wiped. Not stolen, wiped. Every file gone, directories overwritten with a static noise file labeled simply controlled burn. The backups we'd mailed to colleagues never arrived. 3 of the 4 recipients confirmed receiving empty envelopes. 1 never responded. Then came the visit. A private helicopter landed half a mile from the site, unmarked, but clearly military grade. 4 men approached, dressed like field operatives, but with the kind of posture that doesn't come from academia. Their spokesman, a man with sharp eyes and a voice that didn't rise above a calm monotone, told us we were being reassigned under a joint directive. For your safety, he said, and for the continuity of global stability. We were escorted to a remote facility several hours away, somewhere between the desert and nothing beyond it. Inside, we were split up. I didn't see Temi again for 6 days. When I finally did, she was quiet. Not afraid, resigned. They showed me the vault, she said. Not ours, theirs. She wouldn't say more, but I understood. Someone else had known all along. These discs, this signal, it wasn't a new discovery, it was a rediscovery. A confirmation of something buried, not just in stone, but in strategy. A classified timeline. In a final debriefing, we were given a choice. Return to our lives under non-disclosure with access to limited, approved findings, or remain under containment as research assets. Temi chose release. I chose to stay. Not out of loyalty, but because I needed to see what was behind the next door. They call it Project Kimra now. The discs are housed in a solar-isolated chamber. The waveform is mapped in real time against geomagnetic fluctuations, and they've started comparing bloodlines, looking for markers that might suggest prior contact. They're not hiding from the event. They're preparing. Underground cities, seed vaults, population filters. A reset is coming. Not if, when. And the shelter isn't for everyone. Only those with the right name, the right genome. The rest of us, we're insurance. They released me 6 months ago. No official record, no forwarding address, just a nondescript apartment in a city I never intended to live in. I was given a stipend, a therapeutic schedule, and a new identity. I followed the rules at first. Stayed quiet. Took the pills they prescribed. Smiled during the wellness interviews, but every night I returned to the same files. Not digital, those are all monitored now. I rebuilt everything from memory. Diagrams, signal patterns, hand-drawn schematics of the solar calendar. I keep them in a notebook that never leaves my side. I don't know if Temi made it. I've searched for her name in every corner of the internet, but it's as if she vanished completely. No online footprint, no paper trail, not even whispers in the channels that used to buzz with obscure truths. Sometimes I wonder if she chose the deeper path, into the shelters, into silence. If she did, I can't blame her. The countdown hasn't changed. The solar maximum is still projected to peak in 29 months, and with every new sunstorm, I hear the disks pulse again. Not through machines anymore, but in my chest. A subtle rhythm that syncs with solar flares like a drumbeat meant to wake something sleeping inside us. I've started seeing the patterns again too. In public architecture, in so-called art installations, spirals, obsidian replicas, symbols identical to those on the discs, now woven into the fabric of cities as if seeding familiarity before revelation. This isn't a warning, it's acclamation. And the people who know aren't trying to stop it, they're curating it, preparing to inherit a world washed clean. Not destroyed, just rebooted. The truth is simple and horrifying. These cycles aren't random. They're measured, managed. Each cataclysm is a reset not of nature but of civilization, to purge, to preserve and to elevate only those considered worthy. I was never meant to understand that. But I do now, and so I speak, even if no one is listening. Because someday, maybe sooner than we think, the sky will flicker like a faulty screen, and everything we built will fail in unison. And maybe then someone will find these words, this record, and understand that none of it was accidental. It was always part of the vault, and the vault was never meant to stay closed forever. They weren't decorative, they looked like circuitry. At the center was a hollowed pedestal. I didn't touch it. I just stared, trying to make sense of what it was. That's when I noticed the air inside wasn't stale. It was cool and still, like a climate-controlled room. My flashlight dimmed briefly, flickered, then steadied. When I stepped out again, the jungle seemed darker, though the sun hadn't fully set. I heard a sound behind me, just a rustle, a shift of weight. I turned, but nothing was there. Still the feeling stayed with me, that I wasn't alone, that I had triggered something by entering. I packed quickly, but before leaving, I looked back one last time at the platform. The light had changed. It was still blue, but brighter now, not random, rhythmic, a pulse, as if answering a question I hadn't meant to ask. I didn't sleep the night I returned to the village. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pulse, blue, slow, deliberate. I kept telling myself it was a trick of the light, some natural phenomenon I didn't yet understand, but my body didn't believe it. It felt like I'd crossed a line, like the jungle had let me in, only to show me what I wasn't supposed to see. I spent the next 2 days uploading my findings to a secure archive, triple encrypting the video, images, and notes. Then I emailed Daniel's original contacts, not expecting replies, just wanting to leave a digital trail. I should have stopped there. Instead, I reached out to an energy researcher I knew from grad school, someone with clearance and curiosity in equal measure. I sent him a redacted version of one image, just the light source framed against the jungle. His response came 20 minutes later. "Where did you get this?" Followed by a request to speak on an encrypted call. When we connected, he sounded nervous. He told me the glow matched signatures found in a decommissioned project called Horizon Field, an international effort in the 1980s to develop ambient energy sources from non-electrical materials. The project was shut down after funding vanished, and 3 scientists disappeared during a field test in Chile. None of this was public record. He said he'd only heard whispers about it during clearance training, a footnote in a list of forbidden topics. I asked if the energy was weaponized. He paused, then said no, it was too stable, too clean. That's what made it dangerous. "It solved too much," he said. The math implied a closed-loop system, no emissions, no waste, infinite yield. It would have changed everything: energy, transportation, politics, and it terrified the wrong people. I tried to ask more, but the line cut out. When I called back, the number was dead. That evening, I noticed my internet connection behaving oddly, upload speeds throttled, IP reroutes failing. Then my secondary laptop powered off mid-backup. When it rebooted, the recovery partition was wiped. I checked the backup drive. Empty, not corrupted, erased. Later that night, I saw the same black SUV twice, once parked outside the local pharmacy, again near the hotel. Different plates, same make, same model. I moved rooms, paid in cash, turned off my phone. The next morning, a printed note had slipped under my door. Just one line. "Stop digging. The city is buried for a reason." I left Brazil 2 days later under a different identity, carrying only a single flash drive with fragments of the data I managed to salvage. Most of my footage was gone, overwritten, or wiped remotely, but I still had the original image Daniel had sent, the city glowing through the canopy, and a partial scan of the chamber's interior, just enough to prove something existed. I stayed in a rented room near Bogota for a week, trying to decide what to do next. I reached out to 3 journalists, 1 independent scientist, and an environmental watchdog group. None replied. One email bounced back with a warning that the account no longer existed. Another was opened, but never answered. The silence said more than words. It wasn't apathy, it was pressure. I began to notice new patterns. Phone calls, that disconnected after 1 ring, nearby cafe patrons who never ordered but stayed for hours, a man who sat across from my hostel every afternoon, always reading the same newspaper. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, but I knew better. Then, quietly, Daniel's name resurfaced, not in a news article or obituary, but as a co-author on a recently published paper about Amazonian biodiversity. It made no mention of archaeology or energy anomalies. I ran the document through authorship, verification software. The writing wasn't his. The structure, tone, even sentence rhythm, it was wrong. Someone was using his credentials, rewriting his identity. I thought about Thomas, about the fear in his voice when he said it wasn't a ruin, that it had been waiting. The light in the jungle wasn't just a power source. It was a memory, embedded in stone, preserved in silence. A reminder that humanity had once known how to live without destroying, And someone had buried that knowledge. Not ancient kings or forgotten empires. Modern corporations. Energy giants with every reason to suppress a technology that threatened their control. That night, I received a second message, hand-delivered by hotel staff. No return name. Just a sealed envelope with a plain card inside. Printed on it were coordinates, somewhere in Nevada, and a time 2 weeks from now. I don't know who sent it, but I think I already know what waits there. Not another ruin, not a lab, a vault. A place where what they stole is being replicated, re-engineered, or maybe just from us. And if I go, I may not come back. But if I don't, then all of this dies in silence. And the city disappears again. I didn't go to Nevada. I packed a bag, made it halfway to the airport, then turned around. Maybe it was fear, maybe instinct. I told myself I needed more time, more evidence. But the truth was simpler. I didn't trust myself anymore. Not after what I'd seen. Not after what I'd lost. The knowledge I carried wasn't just dangerous, it was incomplete. I couldn't prove what the light was, only that it existed. And no one with power wanted it known. So I went quiet, found a small apartment near the coast, off the grid, with no formal lease and no digital trail. I work odd jobs now, nothing with a paper trail, no phone, no social media, just a single laptop that never connects to the internet. The flash drive stays in a sealed envelope beneath a loose floorboard. I don't look at it anymore, but I remember the silence of that jungle, how the air felt deliberate. I remember Thomas's voice shaking as he said it wasn't a ruin. I remember the blue pulse, the rhythm that felt alive. And I remember Daniel, what he risked to share it. I've come to understand that the real conspiracy wasn't about hiding alien tech or ancient knowledge. It was about fear. Fear of disruption, of free energy, of systems that no longer needed profit to justify their existence. That city in the forest, whatever built it, whoever first harnessed that light, proved something humanity had long since abandoned. That sustainability wasn't a dream, it was history, buried, intentionally. I don't know if anyone else will find it again. Maybe that's for the best. Or maybe it needs to be seen by the right person, someone with more courage than I had. But if you're listening, if this ever reaches you, know this. I saw it. It's real. A city of light, lost to time and buried by design, not a myth, not a metaphor, a warning and a promise. I still wake at night, wondering if I should have gone to Nevada, wondering what else lies sealed beneath concrete and silence. But then I remind myself of something Thomas once whispered when I asked why he stayed hidden. Some truths aren't destroyed, he said. They're just waiting for someone who won't trade them for safety. I'm not that person, but maybe you are. They said it was a myth, an old explorer's tale about a city that glowed deep in the Amazon, but I've seen the photographs and I can't unsee them. I was never the kind of person drawn to ancient ruins or jungle adventures. My work revolved around data, satellite imaging, environmental scans, things that lived inside spreadsheets. But 6 months ago, a researcher named Daniel Arteaga sent me a file labeled simply Nova Cidade. No subject line, no message. I almost deleted it. Curiosity got the better of me. The first photo looked like a satellite glitch, odd, soft, light bleeding through a dense green canopy. But the coordinates were real, buried in a rarely accessed patch of the western Amazon where natural light shouldn't behave that way. The second image showed ruins, angular, stone structures arranged in a grid pattern, partly buried, faintly glowing, not with fire, not with electricity, something else, something pale blue and steady, like bioluminescence, but with geometric intent. I knew Daniel. He wasn't a fantasist. He worked with an NGO tracking illegal logging. His last known location was near the Javari River, 400 miles from anything resembling civilization. After that email, he vanished. No trace, no digital footprint, nothing. I reported the anomaly to my director and filed it under unconfirmed phenomena, which meant it would sit in a forgotten database until someone with tenure wanted to write a paper. But it stuck with me. I kept returning to that image, zooming in, enhancing it, trying to make sense of the light. I ran simulations to rule out reflections, thermal interference, anything. Each time the models failed. The glow came from below, the ruins, not above. And then the data stream from the Brazilian satellite stopped. Without warning, the orbital sensor just shut off. The outage was temporary, but when the feed came back online, that quadrant of the Amazon had been blurred, like someone applied the same sensor filters we use for military installations. I emailed our satellite provider. They claimed nothing had changed. I tried calling Daniel's last contact in Brazil. Disconnected. Eventually I stopped trying, but I saved those images, every frame, because something about that light didn't feel natural. It felt deliberate, like it had been waiting to be found. I didn't act right away. I let the file sit on an encrypted drive while I worked my day job, telling myself it was probably a hoax or some misinterpreted natural effect. But a few weeks later I noticed something strange. The original file Daniel had sent was no longer there. The folder was intact, untouched according to the metadata, but the images were gone, replaced with blank .jpg files and a corrupted thumbnail. That's when I stopped pretending this was nothing. I dug through my system logs and found a remote access timestamp that didn't match any known IPs. The signature wasn't from Brazil. It wasn't even from this hemisphere. Someone had been inside my machine. I started rebuilding the data using backup fragments cached in CloudSync temp files, something I was lucky to catch before the system purged them. As I pieced it back together, I found something Daniel hadn't sent in the original message. A folder buried deep in the directory, mislabeled as a log file. Inside was a short clip, grainy handheld footage taken at night. You couldn't see much, just movement through thick jungle undergrowth and what sounded like someone whispering in Portuguese, then a pause. The camera rose and held on a clearing, and for just a few seconds I saw it. Light, pale blue, consistent and unnatural, pulsing gently from beneath the tree line. Then the feed is cut to static. No GPS metadata, no timestamp, but the file name included a string I recognized, LZ2. It was shorthand from a 1997 report
on failed mapping flights in the same area. That's when I realized Daniel hadn't stumbled on the ruins by accident. He'd been following something already classified. I went down the rabbit hole. I found fragments of a defunct Brazilian
geological survey project that had been quietly shut down after a helicopter crash near the same region. The cause of the crash was listed as instrument interference. I found mentions of an unapproved dig site funded briefly by a European research institute that no longer existed on paper. Every lead ended the same way: abandoned, redacted, or scrubbed. But one researcher's name kept reappearing: Dr. Tomás Caldera. He had once written about unexplained magnetic flux readings in the Amazon basin, then disappeared from public work in 2004. I reached out to colleagues in environmental science, pretending to be updating a university research directory. One of them mentioned Tomás had resurfaced in Ecuador under a different name. He was teaching basic geology in a small village school. When I asked for a contact number, I was told not to. He doesn't talk about the jungle anymore, they said. Not after what happened in the city. I booked a flight to Quito under a different name and paid cash the whole way. From there, it took 2 buses and a rusted pickup to reach the village where Dr. Tomás Caldera was supposedly living. The town was quiet, tucked between hills and riverbeds, with no cell signal and no paved roads. I found him teaching in a one-room schoolhouse made of tin and faded wood. He looked older than I expected, stooped, withdrawn, but his eyes were sharp. I waited until the students filed out before approaching. I told him my name and said I was researching pre-colonial architecture in Brazil. He didn't buy it. "You'll hear about the light," he said, not as a question. I nodded. He turned away, staring out the window for a long time, before speaking again. "They made me sign papers. Years ago. Said if I talked, I'd lose everything. But they already took most of it, so I suppose it doesn't matter now." We sat outside as he told his story. In 2003, he was part of a government-funded expedition studying anomalous magnetic fields in western Brazil. It was meant to be routine data collection, nothing else. But their instruments kept picking up strange readings from a region they hadn't planned to explore. No heat signatures, no typical geological indicators, just a low, steady energy spike that intensified the deeper they scanned. When they flew over the area, their altimeter readings started to fluctuate. The aircraft lost navigation for 7 minutes. When the systems recovered, they realized they drifted nearly 2 kilometers off course, right above a wide clearing. At the center, barely visible beneath the canopy, was a geometric structure. Thomas said it didn't look like anything he'd seen in archaeology journals. No signs of erosion, no plant overgrowth on the stone. It was clean, as if something had been maintaining it. The energy readings were strongest around that site, and at night the light was visible, pale blue like frost or fireflies, but completely still. The team submitted their findings expecting more research funding. Instead, their data was seized by military officials. They were told the light came from naturally occurring phosphorescent minerals, though none were found in samples. Within weeks, the project was shut down and all mentions of it were erased from public record. The worst part, Thomas said, wasn't the censorship. It was the feeling that something had been watching them. Something below the earth, older than their instruments, aware of their presence. He looked at me, eyes hollow. "It wasn't a ruin," he said. "It was waiting." 2 weeks later, I stood alone on the edge of the clearing. I'd hired a guide in Tabatinga, paid him to take me upriver and point out the old coordinates. He refused to go further once we reached the ridge, claiming headaches and strange dreams. I continued on foot, relying on downloaded topographical maps and a handheld GPS that froze twice during the hike. The jungle was dense, but oddly quiet. No birdsong, no insects. Just the sound of my boots on damp ground and the low hum of something I couldn't name. The ruins appeared just before dusk, half swallowed by vines, their edges unnaturally sharp for stone that should have eroded long ago. I took slow steps into the site, careful not to disturb anything. The structures were arranged in a perfect grid, aligned with cardinal directions. At the center stood a stepped platform no more than 10 feet tall, but every surface of it pulsed faintly with that same pale blue light I had seen in Daniel's footage. It wasn't bright, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. I set up my camera, took soil samples, measured radiation. Everything came back normal, too normal. There was no decay, no power source, no visible seams in the stone. I climbed the platform and found a narrow opening at the top, just wide enough to crawl through. Inside was a chamber, bone dry despite the humidity, lined with walls, covered in repeating geometric patterns etched deep into the stone.